Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world where words are rare and glances carry more weight than any threat. We're walking narrow alleys soaked in rain, down Kobe's midnight veins, where neon flickers off puddles and the only soundtrack is your own cautious breath. Somewhere out there, under the weak halo of a street lamp, a boy waits. He isn't lost. He's watching, listening, calculating. Kazuo Taoka doesn't arrive with fanfare. He arrives like fog, slow, silent, and somehow always present before you notice. There's a reason people later called him the Silent Snake. But you're not ready for that part yet. You probably won't survive the long walk through his world if you expect shouting, violence, or grand speeches. His path is paved with restraint and just enough menace to keep an entire underworld in check. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know, where are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it over there? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins in Kobe, sometime in the early 1900s. The exact year is either 1913 or 1916. Different sources say different things, and many people still think that his birth records were intentionally fuzzy. That alone should tell you how slippery the truth gets around him. What we do know is that Kazuo Taoka came into the world with very little. No wealth, no family of influence. He was orphaned at a young age, which was both tragic and, for someone like him, oddly formative. Kobe wasn't Tokyo. It wasn't the seat of imperial politics or refined etiquette. Kobe was a working port town, a mesh of sailors, black market brokers, rice merchants, and wandering musicians. It smelled of fish guts, diesel smoke, and hot tempura oil. The city hummed with commerce by day, and by night, it purred with the kind of low-frequency tension that made people walk faster past dark corners. Kazuo made those corners his classroom. He wasn't loud, never was. Even as a child, his voice rarely rose above a whisper. It wasn't shyness, it was calculation. The louder kids drew attention. They got smacked, pulled by the ear, noticed. Kazuo learned early that invisibility was a weapon. The quieter he became, the more he saw. He'd sit on the edge of fish crates at the port, watching men argue over crates of goods, some legal, some less so. He noticed how the men with power didn't need to raise their voices. They had others do that for them. He noticed that real fear didn't come from shouting. It came from stillness, from the way someone could smile and sip tea while giving an order that would change or end someone's life. There's a tale, half truth, half bar story, about Kazuo at 10 years old. A gang of older boys cornered him behind a warehouse, mocking his silence. He didn't speak a word, just looked at the leader and slowly plucked a splintered chopstick from the ground. He didn't move, didn't threaten, just held it up with eerie calm, eyes fixed. The older boys left. One ran. Some say that leader later joined a gang and refused to ever work in Kobe again. By the time Kazuo was a teenager, he was already known, though not in the way other kids are. He wasn't the best fighter. He wasn't the flashiest dresser. But he was everywhere, watching, helping carry things for older men, fetching cigarettes, staying silent in rooms where silence was needed. Wordlessly, he became useful. And in this line of work, useful was the first rung on the ladder to survival. One of the port bosses, an aging gambler with a love for imported whiskey, took notice. He never heard Kazuo speak more than 5 sentences at a time. but something about the boy's stillness impressed him. So, he started giving Kazuo small tasks. Nothing dangerous at first. Pickups, deliveries, cash runs that required someone who wouldn't draw attention. By 17, Kazuo was brushing elbows with mid-level Yakuza. Still just an errand boy, yes, but now one invited into rooms where others his age weren't even allowed to sweep. He wore a cheap suit and kept his eyes down. But those who knew, knew. He was absorbing everything. And then came the moment. It always does. A higher-up got into trouble. A debt collector from Kyoto crossed into Kobe territory, roughing up one of Kazuo's employer's favorite customers. Everyone expected retaliation, shouting, blood, maybe a knife fight in some alley. Instead, the debt collector simply disappeared. No one saw Kazuo do it. No one saw him at all. But the timing was poetic. The man's car was found at the edge of the river, keys still in the ignition. Inside, a note. "This is Kobe. We listen here." It wasn't signed, of course. But those 5 words whispered Kazuo's name through the underground like smoke through vents. That's how it begins for many gangsters, with noise, gunfire, sirens, screams. Kazuo Taoka began with a whisper, and he never raised his voice after that. The streets of Kobe don't change much, not really. They shift in color and sound as decades roll on, but their rhythm stays the same. Steady, cautious, and pulsing just beneath the surface. By the time Kazuo Taoka hit his 20s, he wasn't just part of that rhythm. He was setting it. He didn't climb the ranks in a blaze. There were no infamous shootouts, no newspaper headlines splashing his name across Japan. That wasn't his style. Instead, Kazuo moved like a ghost with impeccable timing, appearing exactly where influence needed a nudge, and disappearing the moment attention came knocking. The Yamaguchi-gumi, even back then, wasn't the largest syndicate in Japan, but it was hungry. Born from dockworker disputes and local protection rackets, it had the bones of something bigger, if only someone quiet enough could whisper it into shape. Kazuo wasn't a blood relative to the family's founder, Harukichi Yamaguchi. He wasn't even from the same island. But something about his presence felt natural. Harukichi saw it first, noticed how this young man never interrupted, never asked for more than he earned, and never left a mess behind. That last part was important. Clean hands meant clean trails, and in post-war Japan, where Western forces were beginning to peer behind curtains, discretion was currency. Kazuo became indispensable in that gray zone between loyalty and leadership. He handled disputes the way a gardener trims bonsai, slow, careful, and always with respect for the shape of things. He didn't settle scores with fists. He settled them with conversations that lasted 5 minutes and left the other man apologizing without realizing why. There's a saying that still floats around certain Kobe izakayas. If Taoka smiles at you, check your pockets. If he doesn't, check your will. One particular moment marks the shift from errand boy to strategist. It's 1932, and the port union is on the verge of breaking apart. American influence is creeping into the labor movements, and a rival gang from Osaka is trying to use that as leverage to muscle in. Harukichi Yamaguchi gathers his top men. All of them talk over each other, cursing, pounding the table, pointing fingers. Kazuo doesn't say a word. He pours tea for everyone, slowly, methodically. Then he leaves the room. An hour later, he returns. Not with a solution, but with a signed agreement from the union leader. No blood spilled. No threats made. Just a firm handshake. a subtle reminder of shared interests, and a quiet walk along the pier under the watchful eyes of two very loyal men. From that day, people begin calling him Taoka-san, no suffix needed. Respect that isn't asked for, just assumed. It's around this time he starts wearing white gloves. Always. Even in summer. They aren't flashy, just plain, clean, pressed. The kind of gloves you wear when you don't want to leave fingerprints, literally or metaphorically. No one asks about them. They just notice. In a world of machismo and bravado, Kazuo built his power on observation. Where other bosses flexed their muscle, he flexed his memory. He remembered who owed who insulted whose cousin in 1927, who liked sake versus shochu. He remembered faces, never forgot a name, and he never spoke more than he needed to. Silence wasn't just a habit. It was his operating system. At the docks, older workers would nod when he passed. Not because he paid them, but because he didn't meddle. He understood the natural flow of commerce. He didn't squeeze the merchants too hard. He didn't ban drinking, but he banned disorder. He created space for others to operate and charged just enough to remind them who made that space possible. It's easy to romanticize men like Kazuo Taoka, but make no mistake. Beneath the calm exterior was a mind that played chess with razor blades. He wasn't soft. He just didn't need to prove he was sharp. He also had a skill that most Yakuza lacked. He listened, not just to words, but to tone, to pauses, to what wasn't said. And that made him a terrifying negotiator. One Osaka boss reportedly said, "Arguing with Taoka is like shadowboxing with a still lake. You end up wet, confused, and staring at your own reflection." Around this time, Harukichi began grooming a successor. He had sons, nephews, brothers-in-law, but none of them had that gravity, that presence, that terrifying calm. Kazuo never lobbied for the role. He never asked. But in 1942, when Harukichi passed, the elders didn't debate long. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only one man hesitated, and the next day, that man quietly retired, citing health concerns. Kazuo Taoka became Kumicho, head of the Yamaguchi-gumi. No fanfare, no inauguration speech, just a quiet nod in a quiet room. And Kobe in return got quieter too. Under his reign, the syndicate didn't just grow, it evolved. Construction, transportation, real estate, entertainment. He put fingers in pies that didn't even exist yet. Not with brute force, but with leverage, diplomacy, whispered favors, silent handshakes in elevators. It was around this time that American occupation forces began taking a closer look at Japan's underworld. Most crime families panicked, burning documents, relocating bosses, cutting off limbs to save themselves. Kazuo Taoka, he went fishing, literally. He took up fishing. There's a photo of him, blurry and unremarkable, standing ankle-deep in a shallow river, holding a modest catch and wearing those signature white gloves. No one knows who took the picture. No one knows why it exists, but it sits, framed and dusted, in a Kobe seafood restaurant to this day. Just a reminder, while others make noise, real power hums below the surface. He never walked into a room first. That was the unspoken rule. When Kazuo Taoka entered a gathering, be it a meeting with lieutenants or a tense negotiation with business heads, someone else always opened the door. He followed, quietly, calmly, white gloves on, tie never out of place. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't showy, but you felt it. Like the way a room changes right before a storm. Kazuo didn't speak until others were done. Often, he didn't speak at all. He'd listen, sip tea, nod slowly, And then he'd offer something. Not advice, not command. Just a quiet sentence or two that somehow silenced the tension and moved the entire plan forward. That was his magic. He could make men feel like they came to their own conclusions while following his lead entirely. People began calling him the Silent General. Not to his face, of course. Never to his face. The Yamaguchi-gumi was, under his watch, more than a gang. It was becoming a brand, a structure, a philosophy, and it needed faces, public ones. Kazuo knew he couldn't be all things at once, so he played chess with men. He chose young lieutenants with flashier styles, the ones who enjoyed being photographed with their shirts unbuttoned or stepping out of luxury cars. Let them soak up attention. Let the police look their way. Meanwhile, Kazuo sat at the back of a quiet restaurant in Sanamiya, eating cold noodles and listening to the rain. There's a story, a favorite among junior Yakuza. It's 1948. A mid-tier enforcer, a loudmouth from Nishinomiya, decides he wants more territory. He thinks Kazuo's reputation is just myth. That silence means weakness. So he starts making moves, bribes a few port officials, roughs up a handful of Kazuo's men, and sends a message. Tell the boss I'm taking the West Docks. Everyone holds their breath. Kazuo doesn't respond for 3 days. On the 4th day, the enforcer's favorite restaurant closes. On the 5th, his mistress disappears. On the 6th, he gets a polite call from the city's sanitation department. His house is being seized for a public works expansion. No beatings, no blood, just erasure. By the 7th day, the enforcer shows up at Kazuo's tea room, alone. He bows so deeply his forehead touches the floor, Kazuo doesn't even look up. Just says, "The West Docks prefer quiet." That man never speaks above a whisper again. What Kazuo understood better than anyone else was that fear built on violence is loud and short-lived. Fear built on uncertainty, that lingers. People weren't afraid of what he might do. They were afraid because they didn't know what he'd already done. Even other Yakuza groups began adjusting their strategies. Osaka families, known for their theatricality, started recruiting calmer lieutenants. Tokyo bosses tightened their inner circles. You could see his influence in the way others paused before speaking, how they delayed a reaction, how they let silence stretch, hoping to master what he embodied so effortlessly. Of course, with reputation comes responsibility. As the Yamaguchi-gumi grew, so did the complexity of its operations. Money flowed in from pachinko parlors, dock contracts, protection schemes, and even legitimate businesses. The lines blurred, and that was exactly how Kazuo liked it. He began structuring the organization more like a corporation than a criminal syndicate. There were departments, construction, real estate, logistics. There were ledgers, roles, reviews. He appointed capos who could run meetings like boardroom managers, not street thugs. In many ways, he was decades ahead of his time. While the West still painted the Yakuza with tattoos and katanas, Kazuo was building something closer to a holding company. He understood optics. He understood branding. But make no mistake, beneath the suits and spreadsheets, the streets still whispered. There's a lesser-known moment from 1951. A small bar in the Rocco area had been refusing to pay its protection dues. The owner was ex-military, proud, and loudly anti-Yakuza. He even posted a handwritten sign on the door. "We serve the public, not the underground." Most bosses would have made a scene, sent men, broken windows. Kazuo sent a violinist. Every Friday night, the man stood outside the bar and played a soft, sad tune. never said a word, never asked for money, just played. After 2 weeks, the bar owner stopped coming to work. His wife sold the business, and the new owner paid protection, without being asked. To this day, that street is called Violin Alley by locals. No one remembers the song, just the feeling it left behind. Not everything Kazuo did was strategic. Some things were personal. For example, he had an odd fondness for hydrangeas. He tended them at his residence with surprising tenderness. Once, a junior member accidentally stepped on a small potted bloom. He apologized profusely. Kazuo said nothing, just turned away. The man was transferred the next day to Hokkaido. Harsh? Maybe. But in Kazuo's world, attention to detail was everything. If you missed a flower, you might miss a pattern, and patterns were how the quiet man ruled an empire. He also had a rule: no boasting. Any subordinate caught bragging about violence, about women, about money, they were either demoted or dismissed. The more noise you make, he once said, the easier it is to find your throat. This culture of restraint began to attract a different kind of recruit. Smarter, more educated, lawyers, accountants, men who wanted power but didn't want to bleed for it. And Kazuo gave them space to thrive. He was building not just a gang, but an institution, and the world began to notice. The first time a government official bowed to Kazuo Taoka in public, it wasn't news. There were no photographs, no press releases. It happened near the Kobe Port Customs Office, just after a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new shipping facility. A moment so small it could have been missed, except that every dock worker and syndicate lieutenant watching understood exactly what it meant. Kazuo didn't return the bow. He simply adjusted his gloves and walked on. By the early 1950s, the Yamaguchi-gumi had evolved into a shadow bureaucracy. They didn't just collect protection payments. They regulated trade, mediated labor disputes, and even coordinated disaster relief. At times, their efficiency outpaced local government. And at the center of it all stood Kazuo, calm, unreadable, and always 2 steps ahead. His influence extended far beyond Kobe. Osaka's crime families began inviting him to weddings. Tokyo bosses started checking their language before speaking in his presence. But Kazuo never sought attention. His power grew like moss, slow, quiet, and impossible to remove once established. His preference for silence was almost religious. When lieutenants gave him reports, they did so concisely. Meetings were brief, deliberate, and frequently conducted over meals where more food was consumed than words spoken. A new member was once reprimanded for telling a joke at the wrong time, not because it was offensive, but because it was loud. Kazuo believed noise was for amateurs, and yet he understood visibility. Just enough, never too much. He authorized occasional public donations, temple restorations, school supplies for poor districts, relief efforts during typhoons. But he insisted no names be attached. "If they thank us," he said once, "we've made a mistake." He wasn't trying to buy public favor. He was creating silence in another form, one built on uncertain gratitude, whispered respect, and favors no one dared to discuss openly. It was around this time that Kazuo's name began to surface in American intelligence files. Post-war Japan was under American occupation, and the U.S. was deeply invested in rebuilding Japanese industry. Naturally, they noticed the Yamaguchi-gumi, how it operated smoothly, almost like a parallel government. But Kazuo's fingerprints were never on anything. His name appeared in reports only as a possible organizer or subject of speculation. A CIA field officer reportedly described him as a man-shaped absence. Meanwhile, inside the organization, Kazuo continued refining his methods. He created the Kumicho Conference, a quarterly meeting of regional bosses where issues were discussed calmly, with mandatory tea service and no raised voices allowed. Disrespectful tone? You left the room. Overly emotional delivery? You waited in the garden until you cooled off. It wasn't just about power. It was about ritual, about posture, about enforcing an emotional code as strict as any law. This is when a strange cultural shift began. Younger Yakuza started emulating Kazuo in ways that bordered on theatrical. Some adopted his glove habit. Others tried to lower their speaking voices. One even attempted to carry a cane like Kazuo until he was quietly reassigned for trying too hard. You see, mimicking Kazuo wasn't about props. It was about restraint, patience, confidence so complete it didn't need performance. The older members of Yamaguchi-gumi understood this. They revered him not for what he said, but for what he chose not to say. And still, he expanded. Kazuo set his sights on Kobe's construction boom. Post-war rebuilding was in full swing, and real estate was a battlefield of steel, sweat, and signatures. While other crime families pushed into gambling or drugs, Kazuo saw cement as the future. Whoever controlled the unions, the materials, and the laborers controlled the skyline. He didn't bully his way in. He invited. He offered stability. He paid on time. He protected workers from rival syndicates and corrupt supervisors. And in return, he earned loyalty from the ground up. Literally, soon, half the city's cranes had ties to the Yamaguchi-gumi, not with guns, but with quiet contracts. Developers who refused found materials delayed, inspectors unavailable, and permits stalled. Those who complied saw smooth progress and surprisingly harmonious worksites. Kazuo had turned concrete into currency. Many people still think that if he'd chosen to enter politics, he would have dominated it. But that's the thing. He didn't want the podium. He didn't crave applause. He didn't even like having his photo taken. The few portraits that exist show him stiff, unsmiling, his eyes slightly downward, as if already preparing to leave the frame. One Tokyo journalist tried to write a profile on him. The man showed up at the Kobe office, unannounced, polite, eager, wearing a clean suit and clutching a notebook. He was escorted into a waiting room. 3 hours passed. No one came. No water, no instructions. Eventually, Kazuo walked past the door, glanced in, and nodded once. The reporter left. Nothing was published. To this day, that moment is referred to among crime reporters as being nodded off the story. His control extended to law enforcement, too. Not through bribes, though of course they existed, but through a strange, unspoken balance. When officers arrested Yamaguchi members, the syndicate never retaliated. When Kazuo visited a station to inquire about a detainee, he did so respectfully. No lawyers, no threats, just presence. And sometimes, presence was enough. It's said that a Kobe police chief once received a gift after a tense summer crackdown. A bonsai tree with one red leaf, folded over gently, like a nod. No card, no sender. The chief placed it on his desk and never mentioned it again. Kazuo's genius wasn't just in organization. It was in orchestration. He was composing silence into a symphony. The world begins to shift in the 1950s. Japan is rebuilding rapidly. Streets paved, neon buzzing to life, factories churning out everything from radios to scooters. The scars of war are still fresh, but people want futures now. Fast ones, shiny ones, cities swell, money flows, and in the cracks between legitimate ambition and unspoken need, Kazuo Taoka's shadow lengthens. He doesn't resist the change. He studies it. While older gang bosses scoff at television sets and air-conditioned bars, Kazuo sees them for what they are: new arenas, pachinko parlors, jazz clubs, hostess lounges. Entire industries rise on the fumes of post-war desire. And Kazuo? He's already inside them. Not as a gambler, but as the man who decides which neon signs get to light up and which ones mysteriously lose power during business hours. He builds alliances like a watchmaker assembles gears, quietly, precisely, each part turning another. And before long, the Yamaguchi-gumi has a grip on Kobe's entertainment district that rivals its hold on construction and ports. But here's the twist. Kazuo doesn't gamble, doesn't drink heavily, doesn't dance. He visits the clubs like a priest visiting sinners, watching, nodding, occasionally complimenting the lighting. The girls call him sensei, not boss. The hosts clear a path when he arrives. He rarely speaks. When he does, it's something like, "You've added mirrors." Clever. They make the room seem twice as successful. That's the thing with Kazuo. He disarms with insight, not force. He doesn't need to shout. He doesn't need to posture. His very presence edits the room, and he begins attracting attention from higher places. Not just other syndicates, but from local businessmen and politicians who realize that a nod from Kazuo can untangle any knot. He's invited to more and more private dinners, the kind with expensive sushi and guarded laughter. He brings no bodyguards, just a small notebook and a memory like a steel trap. He never writes in it, he only listens. Many people still think that during this era, Kazuo was the de facto mayor of Kobe. Not officially, of course, but if you wanted something built, sold, protected, or silenced, you didn't call City Hall. You called a number you got from someone who told you not to mention their name. There's a scene, almost cinematic, in 1956. A young political aide, nervous and overdressed, knocks on the back door of a restaurant known to be a Yamaguchi spot. He's ushered inside, past steaming pots and old men drinking quietly, into a private room. Kazuo is there. Alone. The aide stammers through a request about zoning permits. Kazuo says nothing, just pours the man tea, listens, then, "You have ink on your collar," he says, gently pointing. The aide looks down, panics, starts apologizing. Kazuo nods. "Don't worry, you're still learning how to wear a suit. That's important." Nothing else is said. The aide leaves. 2 weeks later, the zoning permits are approved. And that aide, he never forgets which lesson stayed with him. This was Kazuo's quiet warfare. He didn't erase enemies. He made them irrelevant. He didn't argue. He waited until your position unraveled on its own. And when the dust cleared, there he was, offering a napkin and a place at the table. By now, the Yamaguchi-gumi is Japan's largest Yakuza syndicate. But it doesn't feel like a gang. It feels like an institution. Suits replace swords. Ledgers replace tattoos. Meetings are held in formal conference rooms, not smoky dens. And yet, underneath all the suits and files, the old rules still pulse. Kazuo keeps the initiation ritual sacred. New members don't shake hands. They drink sake from shared cups in a solemn ceremony, not filmed, not photographed, just remembered. Each man gets a brief glance from Kazuo, never long, never warm, but enough to freeze in memory. And the white gloves? Still spotless. He begins carrying a fan in summer, not the ornate kind, just plain bamboo and cloth. He opens it slowly when the room grows tense. A signal, a reset. One meeting, an underboss grows too passionate, shouting about lost territory, demanding retribution. Kazuo waits, then opens the fan. Click. Silence. Your voice is fighting, he says, but your argument hasn't arrived yet. Wait for it. That man later becomes one of Kazuo's most loyal defenders. Not because he was humbled, but because he was heard. This is where Kazuo begins to mold not just an empire, but a legacy. He starts mentoring selectively, choosing not the loudest or strongest, but the most observant. He teaches by example, by gesture, by withdrawal. His protégés learn that discipline is more powerful than aggression, that the room you don't enter often tells more than the one you do. And yet, for all his foresight, Kazuo remains rooted in something older: tradition, ritual. A quiet code passed down not through books, but behaviors. You see it in how he removes his shoes before entering certain rooms, in how he bows slightly to shrine statues, even when no one is looking, in how he speaks of failure, not as disgrace, but as an opportunity to refine. One of the few written notes attributed to him reads, "There are only 3 kinds of men: those who speak too soon, those who speak too late, and those who speak never, but are always heard. Try to be the third." He frames his entire leadership around that philosophy, but not everyone appreciates it. Rival gangs begin to see his silence not as strength, but as arrogance. They mistake the restraint for weakness. One such rival, a young upstart from the Kanto region, begins poking at Yamaguchi territories, subtle provocations, under-the-table deals with nightclub owners, whispered challenges at drunken parties. Kazuo does nothing for 6 months. Then, in what seems like coincidence, the upstart's nightclub license is revoked. His cousin's business is audited. His mother's health clinic loses funding. No threats are made. No fingers are pointed. He leaves Osaka within a week, quietly. To the outside world, it's as if nothing happened. But within Yamaguchi circles, the lesson is etched like calligraphy. Kazuo Taoka doesn't forget. He just waits. By the dawn of the 1960s, Japan hums with prosperity. The country is a machine now. Shiny cars on winding roads, crowded trains running on time, paper bills exchanging hands faster than anyone can track. And somewhere behind that sleek momentum, behind every well-dressed politician and every construction boom, sits a man who still refuses to raise his voice. Kazuo Taoka has become the gravity around which the underworld orbits. Yet, for all the expansion, all the elegance, all the whispered bows in back rooms, Kazuo remains as still as ever. He doesn't move faster, even though the world does. If anything, he slows down. Meetings become more deliberate, conversations more sparse, and yet more powerful. At this point, it's said that Kazuo could move entire city blocks with a single phone call. Not to shout, not to threaten, just to remind. He maintains his habit of walking the port district at odd hours. No bodyguards, just the occasional trusted lieutenant trailing a few steps behind. Shopkeepers greet him softly. Street cats seem to pause when he passes. He never lingers, but he never rushes. That was Kazuo's way. Walk like the road will wait for you. There's a story from this era that even his enemies retell with respect. A Kyoto-based gang, old rivals from his early days, begins quietly encroaching on Yamaguchi territory in Sanemiya. Nothing flashy, just moving into bars, flirting with suppliers, making offers to businesses Kazuo's men had long protected. The Kyoto boss, a man named Hoshida, is younger and far louder. Known for public displays of dominance, long lunches surrounded by henchmen, and a gold cigarette case that clicked louder than necessary, Kazuo doesn't respond for weeks. Then one evening, Hoshida receives a gift at his favorite club, a plain wooden box containing a single fan, bamboo, cloth, identical to the kind Kazuo often carries. No note, no signature, just the fan. The next day, Hashida withdraws from Kobe. Many people still think that moment marked the end of the old, loud boss era in Kansai. A kind of final curtain drop on theatrics. Even street-level punks stopped bragging as loudly. That's what Kazuo could do. He didn't command behavior. He rewrote atmosphere, and he began shaping the organization accordingly. Under his guidance, the Yamaguchi-gumi created new ranks, administrative positions, compliance liaisons, logistics advisors. These weren't titles handed to tough guys. They were earned by discipline, discretion, and results. This wasn't just to modernize. It was to make the entire machine less dependent on force and more dependent on function. He introduced record-keeping standards, appointed older members to train new recruits not in street fights, but in etiquette, memory, and posture. An internal saying developed, "Before you carry a blade, carry silence." And yet, violence didn't disappear. It simply moved to the margins, surgical, precise, and always preceded by long stretches of quiet. Kazuo believed that retribution, when necessary, should be poetic. A small-time boss once tried to defect to a Tokyo family, bringing sensitive intel with him. He vanished for 3 days. When he returned, his memory was spotty, his hands bandaged. He opened a noodle shop in Fukuoka and never left it again. Every bowl of ramen served under his name became a quiet apology. Kazuo's empire now extended beyond Kobe. Osaka, Hiroshima, Fukuoka, even whispers in Tokyo acknowledged his reach. But he never laid claim, never drew maps. He let others count territory. He counted silence. Journalists tried piecing together his influence. Charts were drawn, arrows pointing from firm to firm, shell companies and holding groups, but always, at the center, a blank space. No signature, no image, just KT in pencil. And yet, Kazuo never stopped tending his personal rituals. He continued his morning tea practice, alone, always. No meetings scheduled before 9:30 a.m. His suits, tailored in Kyoto, followed strict lines. He wore the same watch for over a decade, and every spring he would take a single day away from the office to visit a mountain shrine. No entourage, just him, white gloves folded into his coat. He often spoke to no one that day. It was around this time that his influence reached into media. Film studios began portraying more stoic Yakuza bosses. The brash, wild-eyed archetype gave way to quiet, suited leaders who rarely needed to draw a weapon. Even actors began mimicking Kazuo's walk. Slow, heel first, spine straight. One film critic later wrote, "Kazuo Taoka's greatest performance was convincing an entire generation that silence was cinematic. And yet, as any student of history knows, power attracts pressure." Law enforcement agencies, both Japanese and foreign, began scrutinizing Kazuo more closely. The American FBI, in cooperation with Japan's National Police Agency, launched discreet operations to disrupt Yamaguchi business ties. Wiretaps failed, informants vanished, meetings turned up empty. A senior investigator once quipped, "Chasing Taoka is like chasing fog. Every time we think we've caught him, we're left wet and embarrassed." Kazuo responded not by hiding, but by slowing further. He reduced public appearances, delegated more to trusted lieutenants. But the message remained. Nothing happened without his nod. And then there was the tea garden. By 1964, Kazuo began hosting select meetings at a walled garden behind a seemingly modest residence. It wasn't opulent. The gravel was hand-raked, the pond still. The air smelled of pine and old stone. Only a few were ever invited. Even fewer returned with stories. One guest, a Tokyo banker, reportedly emerged pale and quiet after a 90-minute walk among the maples. Asked what was discussed, he replied, I spoke. He walked. The trees listened. I made my decision. He resigned from his firm that afternoon. That was Kazuo's mastery. He didn't persuade. He created space where persuasion happened on its own. And Kobe? Kobe adjusted. The city hummed under his quiet choreography. Police, merchants, developers, all danced to a rhythm set not by decree, but by example. To see him in those years, thin, gloved, eyes soft but never tired, was to understand that dominance doesn't need to shout, it only needs to wait. Kazuo Taoka knew storms before they arrived. He could feel them, not in the weather, but in the shift of posture in his lieutenants, in the way phone calls got shorter, in the tone of a courier's greeting. And in 1965, a storm began to form, not from rivals, not from politics, but from within. Success had brought expansion. Expansion had brought new blood. And not all of it carried the old codes. Young men were entering the Yamaguchi-gumi who hadn't grown up in Kobe's alleys or felt the silence Kazuo prized. Some came from Tokyo, others from far-flung prefectures. They brought ambition, but also noise. Gold watches, loud laughter, cars with radios too loud. They wanted faster deals, faster promotions. They whispered of modernizing, of softening the old man's grip. Kazuo didn't react. He observed. He knew the disease of fast hunger. And he had a cure. Patience. At a quarterly Kumicho conference, he arrived late by design. Let the young lieutenants fill the air with their confidence. Talk of expanding into media, of partnering with foreign investors, of diversifying into nightlife across new prefectures. Kazuo listened. Then he stood, unfolded his fan, and said just one sentence. Have any of you heard silence cry? And then he left. No follow-up, no explanation, just that sentence. It spread like perfume across the organization, puzzling at first. But like all of Kazuo's words, it sank in over time. What he meant was clear. If you flood the family with noise, ego, greed, impatience, you lose the very thing that made it strong. You bruise the silence. And when silence breaks, it doesn't weep. It vanishes. Within months, the most disruptive recruits were reassigned, put on ice, or quietly exited. A few opened karaoke bars in distant cities. One left for America. Another went back to school. Kazuo didn't punish, he redirected. But that wasn't the only challenge. Other crime families, seeing Yamaguchi-gumi's reach, began forming temporary alliances. The Osaka group from Kyushu, a stubborn crew with deep roots and a flair for violence, tried testing Kazuo's borders. They disrupted a Yamaguchi-backed port shipment in Kitakyushu. Nothing massive, just enough to send a message. A flex. Kazuo's response was simple. Nothing. No countermove. No blood. Just stillness. But weeks later, an earthquake struck the region. Real, destructive, tragic. Kazuo was the first to send food, supplies, and organized cleanup crews. Not just for Kobe, but for Kitakyushu too. His men arrived with gloves and tools, not weapons. The local governor praised the speed and discipline of the Yamaguchi volunteers. The Osaka group? They looked petty. And shortly afterward, one of their key allies defected, citing respect for proper order. That was Kazuo. He didn't beat you. He let you beat yourself. This same philosophy extended to the streets. He instructed his men to stop unnecessary displays. Expensive cars were to be toned down. No more bragging about earnings. Tattoos, though still worn proudly, were not to be flaunted in public baths. Strength doesn't need an audience, he once told a newly promoted underboss. Only applause does. He also introduced an unusual measure, silence drills. Once a year, mid-tier bosses were asked to shadow him or his senior advisors without speaking unless spoken to. For an entire day, some scoffed, but by sunset, most came out rattled, not from intimidation, but from what the silence revealed. The smell of old tatami, the weight of unspoken hierarchies, the ache of decisions made in a single nod. One junior kappa wept during his review. "I didn't realize how loud my thoughts were," he confessed. Kazuo merely handed him a towel and said, "Now you do." Not everything was so poetic. In 1967, one of Kazuo's senior advisors was implicated in a large-scale bribery case involving Kobe's municipal contracts. The police began circling. Journalists smelled scandal. The press grew hungry. Kazuo's response? He walked to the police station, alone, wearing his pressed suit, white gloves, and a folded newspaper under one arm. He didn't make a statement. He didn't demand anything. He simply sat in the waiting area until the lead inspector came out. They exchanged bows. Kazuo handed him the newspaper, bowed again, and left. The next day, a retraction appeared in 3 newspapers. The bribery case vanished within a month. The public? They forgot. The lesson? They remembered. That same year, Kazuo quietly established scholarships for students in Hyogo Prefecture. No fanfare, just a stipend, delivered anonymously. The recipients never knew who paid for their tuition. One of them would go on to become a prefectural judge. It's tempting to think of Kazuo as cold. But his stillness wasn't absence. It was clarity. He was a man who believed in long consequences, in echoes, in the balance between order and ambition. And yet, beneath all that precision, there were rumors of loneliness. He rarely smiled. His personal home was modest. Tatami mats, paper screens, a small fish pond. He entertained guests with green tea and classical music played at low volume. His wife, elegant and quiet, mirrored his pace. They had children, yes, but they were kept far from the business. One visitor recalled dining with Kazuo and noticing the way he looked out the window, not at the garden, but beyond it, towards something distant, something that might never arrive. Even kings of silence are not immune to its weight. Still, Kazuo moved forward. The syndicate was now over 10,000 members strong. Operations ran across prefectures. The line between legal and illegal blurred so artfully that even government auditors had to admit defeat. And yet the man who ruled it all still used the same office, small, clean, unadorned, a desk, a scroll, a tea set. No plaques, no portraits, just presence. And when asked, rarely, what his greatest accomplishment was, he would shrug and say, "They still listen when I say nothing." Kazuo Taoka knew power was only ever on loan. Even as the most feared and respected Kumicho in Japan, he lived like a man who expected to return everything he held. Not because someone might take it, but because time eventually would. Still, if the 1960s had been about expansion and refinement, the 1970s began with a slow tightening of the belt. The world outside was changing. Japan was modernizing at breakneck speed. Universities swelled with radical ideas. Youth culture was getting louder, brasher, and organized crime, it had to adapt or fade. Kazuo did not fight the change. He studied it. He started hosting private lectures. Not in the traditional sense, no podiums or microphones, just quiet gatherings of his top brass, seated on floor cushions, listening as Kazuo explained not what to do, but how to think. He quoted ancient proverbs. He referenced American politics. He once used a go board to illustrate territorial wisdom. One time, he placed a single black stone in the corner and asked, "Is this power?" His men said yes. He nodded, then placed a white stone 6 spaces away. "And this?" They hesitated. Kazuo looked up and whispered, "That is patience." The meetings became legend. At the same time, Kazuo began withdrawing from daily operations, not out of weakness, but intent. He was grooming the next wave, not just as enforcers, but as tacticians, men who understood public relations, international law, financial regulation. It wasn't enough to carry the family crest anymore. You had to carry a briefcase too. This shift wasn't without resistance. Some traditionalists within the organization, older bosses who preferred the comfort of fists and favors, whispered that Kazuo was turning them into salarymen with tattoos. One even dared to say, at a private dinner, maybe the snake has lost his fangs. 3 weeks later, that boss received an invitation to a solo tea session with Kazuo. He went. He returned. He retired. No one asked what was said. Kazuo's silence was evolving. It wasn't just strategic now, it was philosophical. He began quoting Zen poets. He kept a small book of Basho's haiku beside his desk. He no longer attended weddings or funerals unless absolutely necessary. His presence was becoming ceremonial, almost ghost-like, and yet his control remained total. One night in 1972, a nightclub dispute in Osaka turned ugly. A Yamaguchi lieutenant was stabbed by an affiliate of a rival syndicate. Tempers flared. Retaliation seemed imminent. Younger members began gathering weapons, but then the phone rang. No threats, no commands, just Kazuo's voice. Wait, that was it. For 48 hours, nothing happened. Then, on the third day, a letter arrived at the rival boss's office, handwritten. 3 lines. A knife was drawn. A line was crossed, but not by me. No signature. By week's end, the rival boss visited Kobe in person and offered a full apology, publicly. Kazuo, ever gracious, accepted it. With a bow, this mastery of escalation and its prevention became known as the still strategy. It was taught to new recruits like scripture. The goal wasn't to dominate with presence. The goal was to become the quiet voice that others checked themselves against. Would Taoka approve? Became shorthand for any major decision. Meanwhile, law enforcement, unable to pin anything directly to him, resorted to tactics of erosion, tax audits, surveillance, press leaks. Kazuo adjusted. He began moving assets offshore. Quietly, legally. He hired former prosecutors as advisors. He launched community projects under proxy foundations, street cleaning crews, scholarship funds, even a hotline for labor abuse victims. No one could say for sure where Yamaguchi-gumi ended and city infrastructure began. It was genius and maddening. One police chief reportedly remarked, "It's like chasing a shadow on a sidewalk. You can step on it, but it's still there when you lift your foot." Amidst all this, Kazuo's health remained robust. He rose early, ate lightly, took slow walks, maintained his hydrangeas with near religious devotion, and yet there were signs of wear, a slight tremor in his left hand, a hesitation before rising from tatami, longer pauses during meetings. He began speaking even less, letting others fill silence he once owned completely. It's said that during a particularly long strategy session in 1974, Kazuo stood up mid-sentence, walked to the window, and watched a sparrow land on a railing. He turned and said, "Even birds know when to leave," and sat down again. That's when succession plans quietly began. He didn't announce them. He didn't crown anyone. But he began leaning more on 3 men, each representing a different strength: administration, diplomacy, enforcement. He watched how they moved when he wasn't in the room, how they spoke about problems when they thought he wasn't listening. He smiled less during this period, but watched more. And all the while, the world outside grew louder. The oil crisis rocked Japan's economy. Protests flared. Foreign interest in Japanese markets surged. And in the margins, Kazuo played his final great game, integrating Yamaguchi-gumi into the economy so deeply that removal became impossible. He didn't hide the syndicate. He made it relevant. He had advisors attending city zoning meetings. He had front companies applying for government contracts. He had lobbyists, not called that, but functioning just the same, whispering in ears in Tokyo. But more than that, he had restraint. There was no gold palace, no private jets. Kazuo drove a sensible sedan. His suits never flashed. He wore the same brand of shoes for 2 decades. To many, he looked like a retired civil servant, but to those who knew, he was still the man who ended wars with a fan. Still the man who let rivals trip over their own noise. Still the man who once stared at an entire room of shouting men and made them fall silent by opening a notebook and writing nothing. Because sometimes, nothing is the loudest sound. The tea garden behind Kazuo Taoka's office had grown thicker over the years, more shaded, more layered. Moss crept between the stones. The pond, always still, reflected only what it chose. It had become his sanctuary, a mirror, a quiet world carved from the loud one. By the mid-1970s, that garden saw more diplomacy than any government chamber in Kansai. If you were summoned there, it meant one of 2 things. Either your mistake was about to be washed away with forgiveness, or you were being gently guided out of the organization forever. There were no shouting matches in the garden, no second chances, just the soft crunch of gravel underfoot, the gurgle of a bamboo waterspout, and Kazuo's patient silence, and that silence was spreading. By now, Yamaguchi-gumi had become not just the most powerful Yakuza syndicate in Japan. It had become a template. Other families emulated their structure. Bosses from as far as Kyushu and Sendai modeled their operations on Kazuo's code of restraint, but only one Kazuo existed. Imitations, even respectful ones, never matched the original. Meanwhile, the line between criminality and bureaucracy blurred into fog. City officials began casually referring to the group in policy meetings without naming it. Land deals were made without public bids. Construction permits were expedited because things just moved smoother that way. Many people still think that, had Kazuo wanted, he could have run for public office and won. But that was never the point. Power to him was not about title. It was about position. Not where he stood, but how everything else moved when he did. And while his methods aged gracefully, time did not. In late 1976, whispers began within the inner circle. The boss, it seemed, had collapsed during a private lunch. Not unconscious, but paused, eyes open, frozen. It lasted only a few seconds, but for men who had never seen him hesitate, even in the face of rivals, even when delivering judgment, it was a thunderclap. Kazuo brushed it off. Bad miso, he muttered. But from that day forward, the world began preparing for the possibility that he might not be immortal. His steps grew slower. He stopped traveling to Osaka personally. The once frequent late-night walks through Kobe became monthly, then quarterly, then not at all, but he remained present. Always present. Lieutenants still brought updates to his table. Young members still lowered their heads at his passing. The fans still opened when the mood needed resetting. And yet, something deeper shifted. Kazuo became reflective. He began asking questions during meetings that had nothing to do with business. How is your mother? Do you still pray at the family shrine? Do you sleep well? It unnerved people. But it also reminded them Kazuo's strength was never in money, violence, or even silence. It was in attention. He noticed everything. During one winter meeting, a newly promoted captain brought Kazuo a rare tea from Shizuoka as a gift. The packaging was elaborate, the leaves expensive. Kazuo looked at it, smiled faintly, and said, "My father drank this. I haven't tasted it since I was a boy." The room fell completely silent. The captain had no idea. It wasn't planned, but Kazuo had remembered the scent, the texture, the feel of the paper wrap from more than 60 years ago. That's how deep his memory ran. That's how closely he watched the world. Around this time, a journalist, braver than most, published a serialized expose on the invisible hand of the Yamaguchi-gumi. It included flowcharts, interviews with anonymous former members, and detailed financial speculation. The author expected retaliation, maybe exile, maybe worse, but none came. Instead, a small, handwritten note was delivered to the publisher. Just a haiku, unsigned. Fog reveals nothing, but you've named each breeze clearly. Your ink is clever. The journalist kept writing. The story remained untouched. That was Kazuo's way. Disarm by surprise. Respond with dignity. Allow curiosity its place, but never truth its full shape. Even law enforcement backed off in strange, subtle ways. A former police officer once recalled how a surveillance van posted outside a known Yamaguchi building was quietly reassigned, not because of threats, but because every night someone left a neatly folded towel and thermos of tea on its hood. No note, no comment, just acknowledgement. Eventually, the van stopped coming, but not all things could be smoothed by poetry. In 1978, a faction within the organization, young, impatient, hungry, began making waves. They wanted faster territory expansion into Tokyo. They saw Kazuo's restraint as outdated. They thought his silence was weakness. They were wrong, but Kazuo didn't punish them immediately. Instead, he invited them to dinner. At a private tatami room, he served them food personally. Nothing extravagant. Rice, fish, pickled vegetables. No sake. When they had eaten their fill, Kazuo stood. "You've tasted what I built. Now ask yourselves, do you want to season it with noise?" No one spoke. He didn't need them to. The next day, all three were transferred to administrative roles. No protest, no resistance. One of them later became a respected diplomat in the organization, teaching restraint to newer recruits, quoting that dinner like scripture. Even his failures became foundations. And yet, for all the discipline, for all the myth, there were still occasional cracks in the armor. Kazuo would sometimes pause before entering a room, not from hesitation, but fatigue. He'd rub his temple in the garden, eyes narrowed against nothing. His left hand would twitch when he poured tea. One afternoon, a close advisor asked gently, "Shall I handle the meeting today, boss?" Kazuo smiled, soft, almost invisible. "Today," he replied, "I think I'll just listen." That became his refrain in later years. "I'll just listen." But even as he spoke less and moved less, the air around him still obeyed. The city, the underworld, the corridors of power. They adjusted, like reeds leaning toward a quiet river that had shaped them for decades, because silence, when earned, doesn't fade. It echoes. The seasons began folding in on Kazuo Taoka like layers of silk, elegant, inevitable, and quiet. By 1979, Kobe had changed in ways no city planner could have designed. Streets widened, skylines sharpened, businesses pulsed with fluorescent ambition. But beneath the rush of modernity, under the feet of commuters and the shuffles of traders, the foundation was still his. People didn't say it, they felt it. He no longer walked the harbor, no longer sat in his favorite corner of the jazz bar on Sanamiya's edge. But when his car passed by, a modest black sedan with tinted windows, people straightened without thinking. Doormen bowed instinctively. Old vendors paused mid-sale, because even in absence, Kazuo's presence bent the air. And within Yamaguchi-gumi, the same held true. He no longer chaired weekly meetings. Those were handled by his senior advisors, the three pillars as they came to be known. But every decision, every memo, every initiative, they all carried the postscript, cleared by the boss, and the boss was still listening. His home office had grown more spare with the years. One desk, a calligraphy scroll, a small bonsai tended by his wife, a pair of white gloves folded neatly beside a brass inkwell. No computers, no phone clutter, just one direct line, no ringing sound, only a gentle blink of a light. He spent most afternoons there now, reading reports with a magnifying lens, drinking bitter green tea that had grown colder over the years, and listening to the way the wind leaned against the old wooden walls. He rarely offered commentary, but when he did, it came in phrases carved like kanji into stone. Too fast, delay 2 weeks. Let the other side believe they won. Silence here is louder than strategy. The organization didn't just follow him, it translated him. And beyond the syndicate, others noticed too. Businessmen from Tokyo, nervous about foreign takeovers, sought his advice, not on law, but on balance. A mayor in a neighboring city once delayed a policy vote by 3 days, reportedly after a quiet lunch where Kazuo said, "You will regret rushing a decision that takes effect in silence." That phrase would be printed years later on the mayor's memorial plaque. This is where Kazuo's legacy shifted from criminal to cultural. Universities began to reference his leadership in courses on Japanese corporate ethics. One sociology professor from Kyoto called him the embodiment of consequential restraint. Another compared him to a Roshi monk, untitled but universally obeyed. And yet, for all his myth, Kazuo remained heartbreakingly human. He began forgetting small things, a name, a date. He'd pause mid-sentence, furrowed brows chasing a thought just out of reach. His doctor said stress, fatigue, age, but Kazuo knew. He began writing more, short letters, haikus, notes to former adversaries that read more like poems than closure. To one former rival, "The storm was brief, but we both learned from its rain. Now I bow alone." He mailed it with no return address. To a former lieutenant who had defected, "Your absence taught me what my presence could not say." We both lost the same. These weren't gestures of forgiveness or regret. They were echoes. The soft rumble after a thunderclap that nobody noticed until the sky cleared. And all the while, his organization ran like clockwork. Deals were made, territories expanded, but every senior member knew they were walking on the tempo of a man's breath, a breath that was beginning to slow. In 1980, rumors began swirling of succession. Who would take the mantle? Could anyone? Some said the three pillars would govern as a triumvirate. Others whispered of a protege, someone Kazuo had mentored quietly for years. Kazuo never said. He simply kept showing up. Fewer meetings, longer silences, but always present. Then one afternoon, something rare happened. Kazuo summoned a photographer. Not for a newspaper, not for a press release. Just one man, one camera, one room. He stood by the garden window, hands behind his back. No gloves. He looked into the lens, then away. The photographer hesitated. "Sir, do you want to smile?" Kazuo considered it. "No," he said gently, "but thank you." Click. That photo would become the last public image of him, framed in 1,000 places, studied by countless students of power, misunderstood by everyone who thought silence was emptiness. And then, in 1981, the final curtain stirred. Kazuo awoke one morning, walked his garden slowly, then returned inside. He drank tea, spoke with his wife, sat at his desk, and as the afternoon sun pooled onto the tatami, Kazuo Taoka, the silent snake, the still general, the unspoken law, lowered his head and stopped breathing. No pain, no struggle, just stillness. The phone didn't ring. The light didn't blink. No sirens. Just the sound of birds outside, indifferent but respectful. He passed as he lived, without announcement, without plea. The city didn't notice right away, but the wind changed. The streets moved differently, and the air for a moment seemed to wait, just to see if he might return. The announcement came not from a press release, nor a televised address. It was a simple fax, sent to a few journalists, police contacts, and city officials. Just a short statement. Kazuo Taoka, former Kumicho of the Yamaguchi-gumi, passed peacefully at his residence in Kobe. Private arrangements to follow. Please respect the family's wishes. No cause of death, no funeral details. Just that. Quiet, distant, composed. And yet, the ripple was immediate. Shutters were pulled down early across certain Kobe blocks. Taxi drivers drove a little slower that night. Pachinko parlors dimmed their lights just a bit, not by law, but out of habit. Like you might lower your voice at a wake, even if the deceased never asked. Journalists flooded into Kobe. Police tightened patrols. Rumors crackled like static. Would there be a power vacuum? Would the three pillars split? Would a rival family make a move? But inside the Yamaguchi-gumi, nothing stirred. Kazuo's preparations had been meticulous. His absence didn't create chaos. It revealed design. At a closed-door meeting of senior members, held in the same room where Kazuo once unfolded his fan, a single chair remained empty. No one sat in it. No one addressed it. But every glance drifted toward it at some point, and the decision was made. The pillars would guide the family forward, together, quietly, not as a replacement, but as a reflection. The media, hungry for drama, got none. There were no feuds, no fireworks, just silence. And perhaps that was the greatest legacy Kazuo left behind. Not order enforced by fear, but behavior modeled so completely, it became instinct. The funeral, when it came, was private. Even the location was secret. No cameras, no crowds, just a dozen or so men in black suits, some older than others, standing beneath a drizzle of cold spring rain. A single incense stick burned beside a stone etched simply, Kazuo Taoka, 1913-1981. He spoke less than most and meant more than all. His wife, dressed in white, stood beside the stone for exactly 3 minutes, then turned and walked away, leaving behind a small folded handkerchief, white, with an embroidered fan in one corner. No speech, no eulogy. But within hours, stories began to surface. Not in tabloids, but in whispers. A retired dock worker claimed that Kazuo had once paid for his granddaughter's surgery, anonymously. A retired city clerk remembered a time when Kazuo visited his office and complimented the organization of his filing cabinet. 2 days later, the man was promoted. A bar owner recalled a visit where Kazuo said nothing, drank nothing, but rearranged 2 chairs before leaving. Business boomed after that. True or not, these tales grew like ivy on the architecture of his myth. And the city? It carried on. Kobe didn't collapse without its silent architect. But it did pause, as if unsure whether to exhale. The balance he maintained, the space between fear and order, between law and shadow, was now entrusted to men who'd learned at his feet. But something had changed. The silence felt different now. Not oppressive, not empty, just reverent. That same year, a small museum exhibit opened in Kyoto, the hidden structures of Japanese society. It included architecture, etiquette, and, controversially, a small display on the Yamaguchi-gumi. Not directly naming Kazuo, but hinting at a leader whose philosophy reshaped the role of crime in the post-war economy. Many people still think this was the closest Japan ever came to acknowledging Kazuo Taoka's influence publicly, but others believe his greatest monument was invisible, because silence, once shaped, doesn't die. It becomes air, space, rhythm, and in that rhythm, his teachings lingered. Lieutenants trained under him now ran syndicates that preferred diplomacy over gunplay. Police departments, once hostile, now adopted calmer, procedural containment policies instead of brute raids. Even filmmakers, once obsessed with caricatures of chaotic gangsters, began portraying Yakuza as measured, tragic, and quiet. They were all mimicking him, even if they didn't know it. Meanwhile, the tea garden remained untouched. The new leadership respected it as sacred. No meetings, no idle conversations, just upkeep. Gravel raked, moss misted, koi fed. But every so often, an old member would ask to sit there, alone. They wouldn't speak. They'd just watch the pond, let the silence settle around them. And remember, one such man, now in his 80s, told a journalist years later, "I once sat there for 20 minutes, and in that silence, I heard more than I ever heard in my whole career." The journalist asked what exactly he heard. The man smiled. "Everything I needed." And so Kazuo Taoka lived on, not in statues or tributes, but in glances, pauses, tea steam, and decisions that waited half a beat longer before being made. The white gloves were never displayed. The fan was never recovered. But Kobe still slows when it rains. If Legacy could wear shoes, Kazuo Taoka's would still be walking Kobe's back streets. Even years after his passing, the imprint of his leadership didn't fade. It calcified. And not just in the Yamaguchi-gumi itself, but across Japan's broader societal layers. His way of doing things, his patient dominance, his refusal to chase the spotlight, it all lingered like incense in a room long after the altar has gone cold. The phrase Kazuo-style silence entered everyday slang, especially among businessmen and politicians. When a boardroom grew too tense, when a negotiation reached that fragile, breath-held moment, someone would murmur it. "We need Taoka timing." It didn't mean delay. It meant don't rush what's already in motion. Meanwhile, those who had once served directly under him began to rise in other spheres. Some stayed within the syndicate and formed its quiet, unwavering core. Others drifted into business, politics, and community development, bringing with them the same calm rigor, the same preference for order over ego. And those who didn't understand his way, they simply didn't last long. In 1983, a younger underboss attempted to reintroduce a modern model, flashier, faster, and more aggressive. He believed the world had moved on from Kazuo's era of careful silence. He lasted 6 weeks. No threats, no coups, just doors that didn't open, meetings that were suddenly rescheduled, allies who answered calls more slowly. It was like the city itself rejected him, because you don't simply replace still water with waves and expect the koi to stay. Back in Kobe, quiet tributes continued to appear in subtle ways. A mural in a tucked-away alley depicted a koi fish wrapped in white ribbons. A tea shop started serving the Fan Blend, a muted sencha with a note of pine, inspired by Kazuo's garden. Even a local tailor began offering suits stitched with a hidden fan motif in the lining. No advertisement, just word of mouth among those who knew. The silence, it seemed, had become a living language. And as for the Yamaguchi-gumi, under the stewardship of the 3 pillars, it thrived, not through conquest, but through consistency. They didn't try to reinvent Kazuo's empire. They maintained it, carefully, respectfully. As if holding a porcelain teacup filled with hot ink, they reorganized the family's structure further, formalizing departments that Kazuo had once whispered into being. Public relations, conflict arbitration, logistics. They even created a code of internal conduct, codifying for the first time in writing the values Kazuo had only ever implied. It wasn't called the Taoka Code, but it might as well have been. It included phrases like, act with intent, not impulse. Do not interrupt another man's silence. Decisions made in noise rarely echo in memory, but perhaps the clearest signal of Kazuo's enduring influence came during an annual memorial gathering held quietly at the outskirts of the city. No public invitations, no press, just a circle of men, some old, some younger than Kazuo was when he first rose, standing in tailored suits, hands behind their backs, eyes lowered. At the center of the circle, placed gently on a square of black velvet, was the fan. Not his fan, but a fan, identical in shape and material. Bamboo, cloth, pale gray with one brushstroke of ink on its ribs, representing nothing and everything. The ritual was always the same. One man would open it, hold it up briefly, then fold it shut. No speech, no applause, just the click, and each man would bow once. One year, a journalist caught wind of the event, tried to attend. He was met on the outskirts by a boy, maybe 17, holding a sign. "Today is for listening," the sign read. "Come back when you forget how to ask questions." The journalist turned around. So many of these moments, these small brushstrokes of reverence, blurred the line between man and myth. But that was the point. Kazuo's genius wasn't just what he built. It was how he dissolved into what he built. No central statue, no bronze plaque in a square, just a million quiet choices that had learned to walk on their own. And yet people still debated him. Books were written, films made. Scholars argued over how much of Japan's mid-century stability had been quietly brokered in rooms Kazuo once occupied. Some called him a necessary evil, others an accidental statesman. Some painted him as a manipulator who hid corruption behind ritual. Others saw a philosopher in disguise. Many people still think that, had he been born into politics or diplomacy instead of the underworld, Japan's post-war reconstruction might have taken a smoother shape. So what do you think? Was Kazuo Taoka a criminal who mastered the aesthetics of control? Or was he something rarer? A man who understood that noise doesn't always mean truth, and that sometimes power is best expressed by the space it chooses not to fill. Either way, his shadow still stretches, in every pause between decisions, in every bow made slightly deeper, in every teacup poured just before a meeting begins. He is not remembered because he was loud. He is remembered because, when he was gone, the silence left behind was unmistakably his. In the years following Kazuo Taoka's death, Kobe changed its pace, not by necessity, but by rhythm. The tempo that once matched his footfalls didn't halt, but it softened. Trains still ran, cranes still swung steel into the sky, and deals were still struck over steaming bowls of ramen. But something fundamental had shifted. Gone was the ever-watchful presence in the corner of the room, the soundless pause that told a man to measure his next word, the gravity that settled arguments before they could ignite. And while the organization he shaped continued to move like a well-oiled machine, the city's streets, once so carefully balanced under his watch, felt just a little more brittle. Still, his philosophy endured. Lieutenants who had once sat cross-legged in front of him now presided over their own factions. But unlike the Yakuza of old, loud jackets, loud laughter, loud punishment, these men carried themselves differently. Their conversations began slower. Their gazes were longer. Their commands were fewer but carried more weight. It was a culture born not of strict rules, but of learned rhythm. The kind of rhythm you can't teach, only model. And Kazuo had modeled it for decades. But legacy, like water, doesn't stay still. It shifts with the container it's poured into. As Japan moved further into the 1980s, outside pressures began to mount. Western investment poured in. The bubble economy inflated at an almost absurd rate, and with it came a new kind of chaos. Not the raw violence of post-war survival, but the subtle corruption of unchecked greed. New money brought new problems, and some within the Yamaguchi-gumi began to test the boundaries Kazuo had once kept so tightly drawn. Younger capos started flaunting wealth. Foreign partnerships were suggested. Drug trafficking, long considered dishonorable by Kazuo's standards, began creeping in through the back door. The elders noticed. They frowned, but many of them had grown tired. The energy to fight change wasn't the same without their silent anchor. One of Kazuo's former advisors, now in his 70s, reportedly told a colleague, "We learned to plant gardens, but now the young ones want casinos." Still, the organization held together. Barely, but it held. Why? Because the fear of Kazuo's gaze, though he was long gone, still haunted every room. A young lieutenant once threw a lavish party in Tokyo. Imported whiskey, foreign guests, girls flown in from Europe. Halfway through the night, he excused himself, walked out to the balcony, and vomited. When asked why, he simply said, "I felt like he was watching me." That was the genius of Kazuo Taoka. He didn't command obedience. He cultivated awareness. His absence didn't create freedom. It created reflection. And not all stories were of fading reverence. One year, during a particularly bitter winter, a Kobe community center discovered a large anonymous donation had arrived in time to fund heaters for elderly residents. No press, no ceremony, just a card tucked inside. Warmth should not wait for permission. KT, who had sent it? Impossible to say. Kazuo was long gone, but his initials still held meaning, still turned heads. His wife, who had never once spoken publicly about his work, continued living in the same house. She kept the garden, kept the koi fed, kept to herself. But once a year, she would visit a small temple in the hills, burn a single stick of incense, and sit silently for an hour. Locals came to know the date. They never approached. They simply walked a little slower past the temple steps that day. That's what Kazuo's life became in memory. A soft gravity, a slow pull. Even the police began to admit it off record. An officer who had been assigned to surveil him in the late 70s once admitted, "We were never watching him. He was watching us watch him." That's the difference. In academia, his legacy grew stranger. Professors debated the ethical implications of his leadership style. Was it possible to separate his discipline from his criminality? Could a man so feared also be a moralist? One philosophy class in Osaka centered an entire semester around the question, can silence be virtuous in a corrupt system? And still, the mystery lingered, because for all the stories, all the copies, all the efforts to honor or undermine him, no one truly knew Kazuo Taoka. There were no interviews, no diaries, no recordings, just impressions, behaviors, choices made by others, echoing the ones he made first. His death certificate, official and bureaucratic, listed cardiac failure, but to those who had known him, even distantly, the real cause of death was simpler. Completion. He didn't live forever, but he finished exactly what he was meant to build. A system, a cadence, a silence that outlasted its source. And in Kobe, that silence still speaks. At a train station platform, a man in a suit pauses before stepping aboard. Not late, just aware. In a backroom meeting, a senior manager folds his hands and lets 3 men argue themselves breathless before saying just 6 words. A shopkeeper keeps his windows spotless, not out of fear, but out of inherited pride. And every spring, when the hydrangeas bloom in the quiet neighborhoods above the city, someone always places a white glove on a garden wall. Just one. No note, no signature, just presence. The strange thing about power is that once it's gone, people expect it to vanish like smoke. But Kazuo Taoka's influence was never the kind that burned. It was the kind that rooted. Like old stone steps covered in moss. You might walk over them without noticing, but they're still holding up the path. Into the late 1980s, Japan's underworld continued to evolve, much of it still orbiting around the ghost of his legacy. Other syndicates rose, more aggressive, more modern, more eager to exploit globalization. But none carried the same gravity. None had the same hush-following-a-footstep reputation, And even as new generations stepped into roles of power, those who had known Kazuo made sure the lessons stayed alive. One such man, a mid-level advisor now promoted to senior strategist, began a quiet tradition. Every quarter, at the start of each internal review cycle, he would bring his entire team to the harbor just after sunset. They wouldn't speak. They'd walk the old dock roads Kazuo once patrolled, where shipments were counted not just in cargo, but in glances and nods. No instructions were given, but every man returned from that walk a little slower, a little more deliberate. The point wasn't nostalgia. The point was tone. "Remember the silence," the advisor would say afterward, "because when that's gone, so are we." But not everyone wanted to remember. In Tokyo, a younger branch of the organization began to bristle under the old ways. Flashier crimes, riskier operations, a thirst for notoriety that Kazuo would have squashed before it reached a second syllable. These men viewed silence as stagnation, not strength. They laughed at the fan rituals, skipped the tea ceremonies, posted photographs in clubs. It was the kind of noise that Kazuo had spent a lifetime preventing, and it didn't go unnoticed. One of the three pillars, still alive and overseeing operations from Kobe, made a rare phone call to Tokyo. The call lasted 2 minutes. Within a week, the offending parties were reassigned to a logistics post on the northern coast, where their phones got worse signal than their reputations. Nothing official was said, but unofficially, the silence was restored. Meanwhile, scholars began to more seriously examine Kazuo's techniques as a form of unorthodox governance. One doctoral thesis from Kyoto University described him as a non-state actor whose behavioral codes reflected Confucian principles more than criminal intent. Another argued that his leadership style resembled that of certain European philosophers, specifically those who believed the greatest power lies not in commanding action, but in shaping environment. Even the business world took notes. Corporate executives in Tokyo began attending leadership workshops that quietly quoted Kazuo's aphorisms. One slide famously read, "The one who speaks least in the room often owns the building." Still, not everyone appreciated the mythologizing. Families affected by Yakuza violence felt the sting of memory every time someone called him a philosopher don. Victims of racketeering, fraud, or coercion remembered him not as a sage, but as the man who made the shadows walk politely while still walking. This, too, was part of his legacy. Kazuo never claimed to be a good man. He claimed nothing. That was his art. So what do we do with a life like his? A man who built an empire through discipline, but enforced it with unrecorded menace. A man who funded school supplies and also silenced dissent. A man who could end a feud with a fan and end a career with just one absence from a room? One man, anonymous, tried to answer that. In 1989, on the anniversary of Kazuo's death, a short letter appeared in the mailbox of a Kobe radio station. The station had once done a brief profile on organized crime. The letter had no return address, but was signed only, "One who served him." It read, "I once thought I followed Kazuo because I feared him. Then, I believed it was respect. But the truth is, I followed him because he saw me, even when I didn't want to be seen. His silence wasn't cold. It was awake. And that's what frightened people the most." The letter was never read on air, but it was framed and hung in the studio's break room. Sometimes memory doesn't ask to be amplified. It asks only to be placed somewhere it won't be forgotten. In Kobe, it keeps moving. Yes, taxis still honk. Barges still dock. New gangs rise and fall. But every once in a while, when the light is right and the street is quiet, you'll see someone pause before entering a building, straighten their collar, tuck their phone away, bow slightly before a wooden door, not out of superstition, out of habit, because Kazuo taught them to respect not the power of silence, but the shape of it, the contour, the pause it leaves behind, the way it makes a man notice before he speaks. And in that noticing, he stays alive. Not in name, not in photographs, but in silence that still chooses when and where to settle. There's a street in Kobe, narrow, older than most, paved with stones polished smooth by decades of feet that never rushed. Locals call it the Listening Street. It's not on maps, but if you follow the smell of pine from the harbor and let your steps slow without trying, you'll find it. It's said Kazuo Taoka used to walk there at night alone. Not to patrol, not to meet, just to walk. There's no plaque, no monument, just a certain hush to the air, as though the buildings themselves remember him, as though the silence has agreed to stay put, just a little longer. Even now, in the age of speed and noise, of bright LED signs and swiping thumbs, that street remains oddly quiet. Shopkeepers sweep the stones more carefully. Window displays never blare music. And when it rains, which it often does, it rains softly, as if the sky, too, remembers the man who never raised his voice. This, in essence, is what Kazuo left behind. Not fear, not legend, tone. And it's that tone that still lingers, not just in Kobe, but across any room where someone with too much power remembers to pause, where a decision-maker exhales before responding, where a younger man, about to shout, remembers there might be someone listening with better ears than he has. In the syndicate, his absence eventually became something close to a presence. Young recruits still hear stories, how Kazuo once stopped a turf war with a single sentence, or how he memorized every man's tea order without asking. These tales blur into myth, but myth, as always, has its uses. They keep his gloves folded on display at the headquarters, not behind glass but on a small lacquer tray, next to a clock that has never ticked since the day he died. Visitors ask about it. Veterans only say, that was his way. Still, precise, no alarms. A handful of lieutenants have tried to lead like him since. Some have succeeded in parts. Some have failed, loudly. But none have managed to bring back that quiet gravity. That way, the room used to change when he walked in. Even if the lights were dim, even if no one turned to see him. It's a rare thing to lead so fully by restraint. Rarer still to be remembered for it. And as time moved forward, the idea of Kazuo Taoka drifted into culture in subtler ways. A manga artist once modeled a silent sensei on his demeanor. A haiku collection printed posthumously included this tribute. He said almost none, but the wind bowed when he passed. Even trees grew still. A filmmaker, famous now, told an interviewer he once watched a grainy old news clip of Kazuo stepping out of a black car and just standing there. The street fell quiet, and the filmmaker decided then that none of his movie villains would ever speak above a whisper again. But for all the ways Kazuo's memory filtered through art, business, and crime, it's in the rituals of quiet moments that he lives most vividly, like a hand pausing above a teacup, like a man choosing not to send an email right away, like a young underboss standing before a critical decision, whispering to no one. Would he nod or wait? And sometimes, when the world becomes too loud, when headlines scream and the internet pulses like neon on caffeine, people look for something older, something still. That's when they find him again, not in archives or documentaries, but in the deliberate fold of a fan, in a street that listens, in the space between one word and the next, because some legacies shout, but some just stay, without asking, without needing, without ever being louder than the breath you didn't know you were holding. In the years after Kazuo Taoka's passing, a quiet dilemma unfolded inside the Yamaguchi-gumi, less dramatic than a power struggle, but more insidious. It was the creeping question of what silence meant without him in the room. He had not left a single named successor. That had been intentional. The three pillars, each hand-picked, seasoned, and tested, governed the organization with consensus. But consensus doesn't age well in an empire that spans hundreds of enterprises, thousands of men, and untold sums moving across docks, casinos, and construction fronts. Still, for a while it worked. The senior advisors held firm to the framework Kazuo had left. They resisted calls for modernization that felt too loud, too fast. They turned down proposals to enter the drug trade, an industry Kazuo had always forbade. They maintained the same headquarters, the same council rhythms, the same fan-shaped symbol that had, unofficially, come to represent his style. But time moved differently now. A younger generation of Yakuza began to see Kazuo not as a model, but as a museum. They'd grown up in a different Japan, one with satellites, fax machines, and international investors. They wanted to move capital through Hong Kong banks. They wanted luxury watches and club sponsorships. They didn't want to inherit silence. They wanted to own volume. One boss from Tokyo even remarked in an overheard conversation, "Kazuo led like a monk, but we're trying to run an empire, not a temple." Those words traveled. Back in Kobe, the elders didn't react outwardly, but their meetings changed. Slightly, doors were closed more tightly. Notes were taken more carefully, and once again, one of the pillars began invoking a phrase that hadn't been heard since the 1970s. Bring the gloves out. Not as a threat, as a reminder, but friction was inevitable. It came in the form of a brash young captain from Yokohama. New money, new mindset, old ambition. His name isn't important, but his mistake was. He ordered a nightclub hit on a rival, an action that bypassed the pillars entirely. Worse, the incident caught police attention, led to arrests, and made the evening news. Loud, bloody, public, a style Kazuo had eliminated decades earlier. The council met within 24 hours. 3 advisors. 1 long table. No tea was served. When the captain arrived, he bowed casually, smiled. "Sometimes," he said, "a little thunder reminds the street who's in charge." None of the pillars answered. One simply reached under the table, placed a white glove in front of him, and said, "Never needed thunder." The captain was gone by morning. Where to? No one asked. And the message, once again, spread without need for a memo. Kazuo's code was still enforceable, even if Kazuo was not, but deeper cracks began to show. Not in discipline, but in philosophy. Because while the gloves could still correct a man, they couldn't correct a mood. And Japan's mood was shifting. Economic pressure was tightening. The post-war boom had crested, and whispers of recession threaded through the stock pages. International pressure on organized crime increased. Western intelligence agencies were now tracking Yakuza money, and for the first time, American and Japanese law enforcement began sharing names, locations, methods. The silence Kazuo had once used as armor was now being pierced by wiretaps, informants, and audit trails. And the family? It had to adapt. Some parts did. They began investing in technology companies, early computer parts, telecom firms, even advertising. They did so through shell entities so layered it would take a mathematician to untangle. But the money flowed, silently, profitably, yet other parts resisted. Mid-level lieutenants clung to traditional rackets, pachinko halls, hostess clubs, extortion loops that felt familiar. They were profitable, yes, but also vulnerable. Loud, easy to trace. This divide, the new school and the old, was not about age. It was about tone. And without Kazuo's quiet gravity to mediate, small rifts became slow leaks. One internal memo, written in brush on rice paper and circulated only among senior bosses, summarized the situation in 5 simple characters. Dare ni oga suru. Even the water makes noise now. The meaning wasn't lost. Still, the elders held on. They revised initiation rituals to include a silent hour, an uninterrupted meditative session in which the recruit sat alone in a chamber with Kazuo's haiku printed on the wall. Many failed. Some laughed. Those were the ones who didn't return, but those who stayed, the ones who understood, were given not just the fan, but the weight behind it. And among them rose one man, a younger advisor named Masaki. He had studied Kazuo like scripture, not just his actions, but his silences, his way of standing in a room without bending it, of answering questions with a look. Masaki was different. He didn't chase leadership. He inhaled it. He started bringing Kazuo's name back, not in reverence, but in relevance. In meetings, he'd quote him. When a dispute between two Osaka factions threatened violence, Masaki flew in, met both sides separately, and resolved it in 3 hours without raising his voice once. Just a rebalancing, he said. He'd have done the same. Masaki didn't wear gloves, but he spoke like he'd been born holding a pair, and the family noticed. Some began to whisper. Maybe he was the one. Not to replace Kazuo. No one could. But to inherit the silence. He didn't correct them. He simply kept showing up, and slowly, the family began to quiet again. By the early 1990s, Japan had entered its so-called lost decade, an era of financial stagnation, rising anxiety, and vanishing certainties. The economy that once pulsed like a racehorse had gone still. Banks collapsed quietly. Salaried men lost their jobs in silence. And into that silence crept uncertainty on every level, in every sector. But for the Yamaguchi-gumi, silence had always been their language. At least it had been under Kazuo. Now, the question was, could silence still command loyalty in an era of collapse? Masaki, the quiet rising figure within the syndicate, believed it could. He had grown in stature over the past few years. Not through appointment, but through presence. He never courted favor. He answered questions slowly. He corrected others only with one-liners, most of which were paraphrased from Kazuo's old remarks. When a young lieutenant in Osaka barked over a budget dispute, Masaki said nothing for the entire meeting. Then, as the others stood to leave, he turned and offered only, "You spoke first. I hope you're also right." The room went still. The issue resolved itself. He was not Kazuo. Everyone knew that. But he listened the way Kazuo had. Not just with ears, but with space. He let men reveal themselves, allowed problems to expand until they popped from their own pressure. That kind of leadership was rare, and many of the elders, the ones who had personally bowed before Kazuo's desk, began to quietly support him. But power never transfers without tremors. A new faction had been forming quietly in Tokyo, younger, faster, more aggressive. They resented Kobe's hold on the organization. They saw Masaki as a throwback, too quiet, too disciplined, not adaptable enough for the 1990s. They wanted press, real estate, branded ventures, a more visible seat at the table of Japan's new economy. They called Masaki the Echo. He didn't flinch. In fact, during a rare trip to Tokyo, Masaki met with one of their envoys at a private ryokan. According to the staff, they spoke for exactly 19 minutes. No raised voices, no sake served. When it was over, the envoy bowed deeply, thanked Masaki, and flew to Fukuoka the next day. He never returned to Tokyo politics. No one knows what Masaki said, but rumor has it he brought one object into the meeting: a folded fan, gray with a single black stroke. Sound familiar? It wasn't Kazuo's original. That had long since disappeared. Some said buried with him, others said burned. But the fan's presence, its meaning, still translated. In the months that followed, Masaki quietly restructured the council. Not a coup, a correction. He began holding smaller meetings, 2 or 3 men at a time. He removed those who had become too loud, too fond of headlines. He encouraged some to retire, sent others to observe operations in Okinawa or rural Hokkaido. Long assignments, lots of silence. The organization began to breathe again. Even the police noticed. One detective, who had surveilled Yamaguchi meetings for over a decade, remarked to a journalist, "The air's different again, like someone remembered how to hold the room without speaking. It wasn't just internal. Outside, Masaki extended Kazuo's old practice of low-profile civic influence. He funded scholarships, again, anonymously. He sent donations to cultural institutions. He even arranged for the repair of a storm-damaged shrine in Kobe, under the name of a defunct shipping company. No handprints, no signatures, just balance. In one particularly poetic move, he ordered that no member under his direct command could own a car louder than 65 decibels, not because of image, because sound draws maps. Some called it overkill, but Masaki didn't argue. He just kept showing up, and still, he didn't seek the top title. When asked directly why he hadn't taken the mantle of Kumicho, he answered, "The title is a sound. I prefer shape." That became a mantra among a new generation of lieutenants. In Kobe, those who had walked beside Kazuo in the old days now walked beside Masaki, not because they feared him, but because they recognized something unnervingly familiar. He didn't need to win arguments. He just needed the room to settle. One night, during a strategy session that had grown tense, a mid-level boss stood and said, "I think we should speak more plainly." Masaki turned slowly, met his gaze, and said, "Why?" "So the silence can misunderstand you." The man sat down, not humiliated, just aligned. And in that moment, the others nodded. Because once again, the organization had begun to remember. Leadership isn't about volume. It's about what survives after you leave the room. The longer Masaki led without leading, the more powerful he became. He never once sat in the Kumicho's chair at headquarters. It remained untouched, polished, respectful, ceremonial. Some said it was a matter of humility. Others whispered it was deference, not just to Kazuo's memory, but to the idea of silence as sovereign. After all, when the throne speaks louder than the king, the kingdom forgets who shaped it. Instead, Masaki operated from a side office, a room smaller than some lieutenants' lounges. Tatami floors, 2 chairs, a narrow wooden desk. The only ornament on the wall was a fan-shaped ink painting with no signature. Visitors entered with shoes off and voices low. He never made them wait long, never offered drinks, never interrupted. And this discipline, this lack of ceremony, only made his influence sharper. But the outside world was changing, faster, and with less interest in inherited stillness. Japan's economic stagnation had frayed patience across all sectors. White-collar crime was on the rise. Street-level violence, though still taboo in the upper echelons of Yamaguchi-gumi, had returned in Tokyo, where newer criminal outfits operated without tradition. They were bold, transactional, often foreign-backed. They didn't bow, they didn't pause, and they didn't know the name Kazuo Taoka. To them, Masaki was a relic, unbranded, analog, operating at half speed in a world chasing metrics. One such crew, a young gang aligned with foreign investors and specializing in nightlife racketeering, began muscling into Kobe's outer entertainment districts. They didn't ask. They didn't warn. They just showed up. New signage, faster cars, and gaudier suits. The older members of Yamaguchi-gumi were livid. "What would Taoka have done?" one senior capo asked, pacing the meeting room. Masaki said nothing. He just listened. Then, 2 nights later, the new gang's primary nightclub went dark. Not violently. No gunfire, no screams, just no electricity. Then their permits were reviewed. Their suppliers changed terms. Their delivery vans were redirected. Their staff stopped showing up. Within 4 days, they left Kobe. No one touched them. No one even spoke to them. The message was clear. You entered a room where the floor listens. That phrase, strange, even poetic, began circulating in Yamaguchi channels. It was attributed to Masaki, though he never confirmed it. Still, it captured his presence. He didn't shake walls, he made walls pay attention, and in that way, he embodied Kazuo's essence more than anyone since. But not everyone liked that. A growing faction of internal dissenters, mostly lieutenants who had climbed under other bosses, who had learned ambition from Tokyo's chaos, began to murmur. They wanted more aggressive expansion. They wanted digital assets, cryptocurrency. They wanted to leverage influence, not protect it, and they saw Masaki as the cork in the bottle. He's the best lieutenant we never promoted. One man sneered in a private dinner, unaware that the hostess had once served Kazuo tea. The comment, like most things in that world, found its way back. Masaki didn't respond, but soon after, the man's territory was absorbed into another branch, legally, on paper. Streamlined for operational clarity, the memo read. The man himself? Reassigned to audit legacy records in Nagano. He accepted the post, quietly, because even the dissenters knew. Masaki didn't fight you. He removed your stage. The three pillars, now elders nearing the end of their tenure, began visiting Masaki one by one. Not formally, not to endorse, just to sit, to ask small questions, to observe how he carried himself in their absence. They began referring to him with a phrase once reserved only for Kazuo, the one we follow by instinct. No ceremony followed, just nods exchanged in low-lit corridors. Outside the syndicate, Masaki's presence began surfacing in strange ways. A police official in Osaka mentioned him during an interview, referring to a quiet era returning to Kobe. A Kyoto museum asked permission to display a replica of Kazuo's white gloves. Even foreign intelligence reports began marking a decline in Yamaguchi-related violence, but an increase in financial movement through front organizations. Masaki wasn't tightening the grip. He was adjusting the gloves, and yet he remained elusive. No press photos, no interviews. His name, though whispered more frequently now, never made headlines. He didn't dine in public. He didn't leave Kobe for more than a day at a time, and when he walked, alone, always, he used the same street Kazuo had walked decades prior, the listening street. Locals knew better than to greet him. They simply stepped aside, and that's when it became clear to the remaining elders. Kazuo had returned not in flesh, but in shape. The silence moved again, and the empire once again adjusted its breath. There's a phrase whispered in Kobe's old neighborhoods, especially among those who've lived through the shifts. Silence changes coats, but never voice. To the average ear, it sounds like poetry. But to those who've ever dealt in the undercurrent, contracts signed with nods, debts honored with glances, it means something sharper. It means Kazuo Taoka may be gone, but the way he shaped silence still speaks. And by the mid-1990s, that voice had found a new vessel in Masaki. By now, Masaki had become not just a symbol of continuity, but a barometer. When disputes rose in Osaka, his absence from the conversation told more than any decree. When a junior boss hesitated before making a move, it was often because someone had said, "Masaki hasn't spoken yet." He had not taken the title of Kumicho, still refused it, but the seat itself no longer mattered. The tone he carried had become the seat, but there was tension too. With the economic stagnation lingering and globalization sweeping across Asia, external actors, crime syndicates from China, Korea, even Southeast Asia, began probing Japan's underworld, not for war, but for merger. These groups were aggressive, modernized, and equipped with tech that traditional Yakuza had little experience with. Encrypted networks, money laundering schemes through offshore real estate, weapons trades via digital ghost networks. Yamaguchi-gumi, under Masaki's influence, had kept its structure elegant but analog. It still favored hand-delivered messages, handwritten ledgers, and in-person loyalty tests. But now, the question loomed like fog above the port. Could silence survive the age of surveillance? Masaki's response came, as always, not through a statement, but a maneuver. He formed the Pearl District Accord. It wasn't a treaty. It wasn't even acknowledged in writing. But those who mattered knew what it was. It was a set of understandings, delicate, precise, between three major syndicates operating in Japan: Yamaguchi-gumi, Sumiyoshi Kai, Inagawa Kai. Each retained their territories. Each agreed to respect Masaki's pace. The meetings were always held in the Pearl District of Kobe, inside an unremarkable tea house with no signage, next to a bookstore that had been closed for years. There was no security, only umbrellas lined outside the door. Inside, they drank tea. Paper fans were folded, not opened, and every leader was allowed one sentence per session. Masaki rarely used his "he listened," and that somehow made his point louder. The Pearl District Accord held for years. Violence dropped. Cross-territorial deals rose. The police noticed but couldn't trace its workings. A detective once wrote in a private log, "No wiretap ever caught a sentence worth arresting." But not all within the family admired the accord. Some saw it as weakness, cooperating with rivals, pausing expansion, refusing to confront foreign infiltration with force. A group of younger captains, emboldened by digital tools and international contact, pushed back. Quietly at first, then not. They began bypassing Kobe altogether. They set up shadow operations in Tokyo, in Nagoya. They made deals with foreign operatives. They began to talk. Too much, too often, and then came the leak. A briefcase full of internal documents, financial records, organizational diagrams, left in a Tokyo parking structure. Whether lost, stolen, or planted, no one knew. But its contents ended up in the hands of an investigative journalist. The article never ran. It didn't need to. Within 2 days, every captain involved resigned, voluntarily. Some moved abroad. Some went into the mountains. A few simply vanished. Masaki never mentioned it. He didn't summon anyone, didn't issue consequences. He simply arrived one morning at the tea house in the Pearl District and opened the fan. Once, a rare move. Everyone understood. The message was simple. We can modernize, but we do not leak. And the fan was closed again. From that point forward, digital operations were restructured under a new branch, one overseen by an unlikely figure, a former university professor who had been quietly advising Masaki for years. He introduced encryption, digital laundering tools, and secure logistics software. But before accepting the role, he asked Masaki a simple question. "Is there a place for code inside silence?" Masaki had smiled. "Only if it whispers." The professor nodded. And so began Yamaguchi-gumi's true digital pivot. Not loud, not flashy, but deeply structured, invisible as always. Soon after, an American financial crime unit noticed that one of their flagged funds, once tied to a Tokyo-based laundering ring, had simply disappeared from the map. No trail, no pattern, just gone. They dubbed it the Black Fan account. Coincidence, perhaps, but those who knew, they didn't believe in coincidence. Back in Kobe, the council began to refer to this new phase not as an era, but as a shade. Masaki's shade, they called it, not a rain, a presence less definable than Kazuo, but no less precise. And in a world growing louder by the day, the syndicate held firm, because when silence learns to encrypt, even thunder forgets how to speak. By the late 1990s, the world had fully stepped into the blur of globalization. Tokyo flashed with brighter lights. Kobe's harbor saw more foreign ships than local ones, and the criminal underworld found itself standing on a tightrope suspended between tradition and transformation. For many, this was a time of reinvention, but for Masaki, it was a time of refinement. He had no interest in expansion for expansion's sake. He often said, when he said anything at all, that a house that grows too quickly forgets the shape of its own roof. And so, while other syndicates pushed into international drug trafficking, internet gambling, and smuggling through Southeast Asian ports, Yamaguchi-gumi under Masaki drew inward, tightening, polishing, shedding noise, but don't mistake that for weakness. While younger organizations chased headlines, Masaki's operations slipped deeper into legitimate infrastructure. He invested quietly in cold storage facilities, logistics hubs, regional rail lines, and even a network of vending machines that were, on paper, nothing more than convenient caffeine delivery systems. But through them, messages moved, payments were routed, people passed unremarked. Visibility, Masaki once remarked, is the polite word for vulnerability. That became an operating doctrine, one that caused tension. Again, a prominent Tokyo capo, frustrated with Masaki's pace, began a back-channel campaign to replace him. He didn't call for a coup. He was smarter than that. Instead, he proposed modern stewardship, a phrase that tried to cloak ambition in logic. He suggested splitting operations, Tokyo for him, Kobe for Masaki, a dual leadership, faster growth, media adaptation. A chance to move at the speed of the world, he said in a memo that was never supposed to be seen outside his circle. But it was, and it reached Masaki the way all things did, by silence. He made no move for 2 weeks. Then he called for a meeting, not in Kobe, but in Kyoto. Neutral ground, a tea house near the Kamo River. Only the Tokyo Kappa was invited. They sat across from each other. No bodyguards, no lieutenants, just 2 men and a single pot of tea between them. The conversation, by most accounts, lasted less than 12 minutes. No one heard what was said, but when the Tokyo Capo left, he boarded the next train east, and within 48 hours announced his retirement. In his public statement, he praised Masaki's clarity and said the family's future was best carried by the one who remembers the weight of silence. Internally, that moment became known as the quiet correction. It ended all further talk of restructuring, and the family settled again. But even as the organization stabilized, the outside world grew noisier. International crime syndicates had become emboldened. Russian groups began moving into shipping logistics. Triads expanded into Hong Kong's legal market. American mobs, though fractured, sought digital laundering methods through shell tech firms. Masaki saw it all and responded not with confrontation, but with insulation. He created a barrier, a conceptual firewall called the perimeter. It wasn't software. It wasn't paperwork. It was methodology. Within Yamaguchi-gumi, only certain men were allowed to interface with the outside world. Only designated cells handled international dealings. The rest focused on domestic discipline. This decentralization was radical and efficient. If one unit was compromised, the rest were unaffected. It was Kazuo's compartmentalization ethic, updated for the digital era. One intelligence analyst reviewing the group's structure in 1999 wrote, "They've become not one syndicate, but a system of syndicates with a shared tempo," exactly as Masaki intended. Still, there were moments of danger. One came in the form of a cyber attack. A group of foreign hackers, unaware of the group's depth, targeted one of Yamaguchi's shell companies in hopes of cracking a laundering network. They succeeded in part. They uncovered a flow of funds moving through a logistics firm in Hokkaido. They released the findings online, but within hours the company folded. Accounts emptied, offices cleared, and a strange thing happened. A message appeared on a deep web forum frequented by cyber criminals. It read, "Congratulations, you found one glove, the other holds the knife." No one ever claimed responsibility, but cyber attacks on the group's assets dropped by 85% the following year. Internally, Masaki addressed none of it. He simply scheduled a walk through Kobe's Western District, greeted a few vendors, and paused, just briefly, at a bookstore that hadn't opened its doors in 2 decades. He looked at the door. adjusted his cuff, then kept walking. To his lieutenants, that meant the perimeter was holding. To the city, it meant he still watched. One journalist, piecing together these developments in a retrospective, concluded, "Where others speak of legacy in stone, Masaki writes in dust." But somehow, it never blows away, and within the Yamaguchi-gumi, a new name began to echo. Not Masaki, not the silent snake, just this. The fan holder, not a title, not a crown, just a shape, folded, carried, ready. By the turn of the millennium, the underworld had become crowded, not in numbers but in noise. Syndicates across Asia were branding themselves. Websites emerged. Rumors of social media infiltration began circulating among younger members. Foreign operatives wore tailored suits and talked in PowerPoint. The crime world had started marketing itself, but not in Kobe. In Kobe, the air still moved slowly, and at the center of that stillness, now more myth than man, was Masaki. He still didn't hold the title of Kumicho. And yet, in internal communications, messages now ended with a single glyph. A folded fan, drawn in 2 strokes. No name, no seal. Just a sign that the message came from the one who didn't need to be named. It wasn't power in the traditional sense. It was quiet gravity, the kind that bends everything around it without ever moving itself. But as global eyes turned sharper, as financial regulators and international watchdogs zeroed in on Yakuza assets, even Masaki's style began to press against the outer walls of possibility. Laws changed. A new wave of anti-Yakuza legislation swept through Japan. Banks refused to serve known members. Landlords evicted tenants with even a whisper of underworld ties. Mobile carriers blocked numbers traced to suspected affiliates. It was no longer enough to be silent. Now survival required invisibility. Masaki didn't panic. He pivoted. He began dismantling the public limbs of the organization. He sold off office buildings, closed visible social clubs, even let go of several publicly known charitable fronts. To outsiders, it looked like a retreat. To insiders, it was a smoke drift maneuver. A complete withdrawal into the mist. Everything moved underground. No more uniforms, no more flags, no tattoos on display. Orders delivered through intermediaries who didn't even know they were delivering orders. And yet, the work continued. Territories were maintained. Debt collection remained punctual. Protection networks stayed operational. But they moved through softer channels now. Through real estate, insurance, logistics. A new phrase began circulating among the younger members. If it's loud, it's dying. They attributed it to Masaki, though he never claimed it. In Tokyo, rival groups began suffering arrests, some due to internal informants, others to careless financial trails. One syndicate leader was picked up while speaking to the press. Another was photographed partying on a yacht, later seized by customs. Meanwhile, Masaki, he attended a kabuki play, alone, dressed in gray. He sat in the 3rd row, center, said nothing, clapped only once. A photo of the moment surfaced online, blurry, distant. No one could confirm it was him, and still, that image triggered an entire investigative series in one newspaper. The headline read, "The Ghost Who Watches." But Masaki didn't haunt. He refined. He began placing men into consulting firms, into architecture companies, into legal teams, not with fake names, but with clean ones, backgrounds built slowly over years. Some of these men didn't even know, at first, that they were part of the syndicate. They were loyal to Masaki, not through fear, but through purpose. They were taught not to extort, but to influence, not to bribe, but to balance. And this shift created something new. Not a gang, not even a family, but a shadow structure. Something between crime, code, and culture. It didn't need borders. It moved through tone. And yet, internally, the question arose. Would it survive without Masaki? He was aging now. Slower steps, longer pauses, fewer appearances. When asked directly about his successor, he smiled gently. "The next silence will choose itself," he said. Those were his only words on the matter, and perhaps it was enough, because by then, everyone had stopped waiting for declarations. They had begun watching for patterns, for who paused the longest before replying, who folded their paper once instead of twice, who left a room without their chair making a sound. Kazuo Taoka had shaped the foundation. Masaki had reshaped the ceiling, and now the house itself seemed to be learning how to breathe on its own. In an old office drawer tucked behind outdated ledgers and expired keys, one elder found a note, written years prior, unsigned. "If they forget your name but remember how to sit, you've led well." No one knew who wrote it, but no one questioned whose hand had once folded that paper. And in that silence, the next chapter waited, not loudly, but with perfect posture. The last photograph of Masaki wasn't a photograph at all. It was a memory, preserved not on film, but in the quiet retelling by a florist who kept shop on the edge of the harbor. He came in early, she recalled years later. Before the shutters were even open, he bought a single hydrangea, pale blue, said nothing, just nodded, paid in exact change, and walked out with it resting in both hands, like it was heavier than it looked. No one saw him after that. No announcements, no funerals, no official statements, just absence. And yet, the structure he had built didn't stutter, because Masaki had done what Kazuo Taoka had done decades earlier. He had trained silence to lead without him. Within the Yamaguchi-gumi, nothing changed visibly. Meetings still began with stillness. Instructions were still relayed without attribution. Promotions were still earned not through declarations, but through demonstrated control. But there was a moment, a precise moment that signaled to those who knew, Masaki is gone. It came in the form of a council meeting where the chair he had once used, not the Kumicho's, but the smaller one in the side room, was left unoccupied. No one sat there. No one acknowledged it. But the incense burned slightly longer than usual. That was all. The organization moved forward, not in defiance of change, but in preparation for it. And the next wave of leadership was different, younger, fluent in both legacy and legality. Some held MBAs, others had studied law. They didn't quote Kazuo or Masaki, but they mirrored them, through cadence, through avoidance, through how long they waited before ending a meeting. They knew not to replace silence. They knew only to maintain its perimeter. And Japan, in turn, adjusted again. Law enforcement agencies reported fewer confrontations, more cases resolved before escalation. Political donations came from obscure but law-abiding sources. Public incidents involving Yakuza members dropped to historic lows. To outsiders, it seemed like retreat. To insiders, it was refinement's final act. A journalist covering organized crime attempted a feature article on the new Yamaguchi-gumi. After 3 months of research, she published a blank page with only one sentence. "They speak less now. I understand them more." It won an award. But even as the organization continued, Kobe itself began to show the erosion of memory. The younger generation, those born after Kazuo, who only knew Masaki through stories, started forgetting the particulars. The rituals became customs. The customs became habits. The habits became faint, and with fading comes danger. One district captain, young and recently appointed, began making deals with reckless actors from overseas. Flashy meetings, digital currencies, even social invitations to influencers. He believed the organization needed a public face, but Kobe has its own immune system. One morning, he arrived at his office to find a white envelope. Inside, a single line. "The face you show is not the face we shaped." He resigned the same day, took a flight to Sapporo, and never returned. No one admitted to writing the note, but the message had been received and translated. Elsewhere, signs of Kazuo's era began vanishing. The tea house in the Pearl District closed. its wood weathered and floor mats brittle with time. The bookstore next door became a parking lot. The garden behind Yamaguchi's former headquarters was trimmed back, part of a modernization initiative. And yet, someone still raked the gravel every morning. Someone still refilled the koi pond. Someone, unnamed, unseen, maintained the rhythm. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about function. Because once a silence has shaped a place, it doesn't leave. It just adjusts its volume. A university professor, conducting interviews on postmodern influence in criminal hierarchies, concluded his paper with this strange line: "The Yamaguchi-gumi is no longer an organization. It is a cadence." He couldn't explain it further. But in Kobe, that sentence made perfect sense. People still paused at certain alleys, still walked slower down Listening Street, still left a fan on the table when decisions were too large for words. And that's how the next generation would inherit. Not by name, but by echo. Some say legacy is what you leave behind. But in Kazuo Taoka's world, legacy was what you removed, carefully and completely, so that nothing unnecessary remained. That was the final artistry. Erasure as preservation. And Masaki, he learned that principle well. By the early 2000s, the organization no longer looked like an organization. It was infrastructure without signage, rhythm without conductor, a system so lean and reactive that outsiders mistook its efficiency for decay. But within, the family endured, not by building monuments, but by maintaining patterns. An example: in a quiet Kyoto office, a mid-level operative known only as Mitsu handled real estate audits for a logistics subsidiary. By all appearances, he was a regional analyst, barely mid-tier, but twice a month, Mitsu visited a forgotten apartment complex on the edge of Kobe, one untouched by redevelopment. There, he drank tea with an elderly woman who had once managed the records for Kazuo Taoka's first trucking venture. She no longer remembered faces well, but she remembered cadence. And Mitsu? He didn't ask for wisdom. He listened to her talk about garden weather and train times. Because sometimes, the way someone folds a napkin tells you more about history than any file. Elsewhere, a young woman joined the public face team, an unofficial term for those who held actual jobs in law, media, or government, but traced their ethical compass back to the syndicate. Her work? Legal consulting. Her hobby? Origami. She folded paper cranes during breaks. Each crane used exactly 2 folds from Kazuo's fan pattern, an homage she never mentioned, but always respected. That's how legacy persisted, not in power, in gesture. But nothing remains untouched forever. By 2005, a massive investigative campaign across Japan began to root out all anti-social forces. The term was vague, but its purpose was not. Police cracked down on known families, froze assets, arrested members for even minor offenses, and while many groups cracked under the pressure, the Yamaguchi-gumi adjusted. They issued no statements. Instead, bank accounts vanished, business names changed, every single leadership name listed on corporate filings was replaced overnight, and the ones that weren't were already dead. The government issued reports, journalists speculated, charts were drawn with lines connecting ghosts, and in the middle of every chart was a blank space labeled unknown influence, the fan holders echo. Meanwhile, younger syndicates across Asia, those without grounding in legacy, fumbled under pressure. Violence surged, police budgets soared, and yet Kobe remained quiet. Too quiet, according to one frustrated official. He visited the city himself, toured potential hotspots, demanded records. What he found? A declining crime rate, empty storefronts with clean books, retirees running tiny cafes where conversations paused just long enough to be polite. He returned to Tokyo, gave a press briefing, and admitted, "There's nothing there, but it feels like someone already answered every question I didn't ask." That quote went viral, And inside the Yamaguchi-gumi, it was written in ink on a scroll and hung in a corridor behind the oldest meeting room. No title, no signature, just the words, because some rooms still speak, even if they've forgotten your name. Around this time, a new unofficial leader began to emerge. Not by appointment, but by recognition. She had no tattoos. She rarely attended meetings. She had worked for years as a negotiator between shipping companies and city regulators. But when conflict arose between two factions in Nagoya, both refusing to budge, she flew in without announcement, invited both parties to dinner, served tea herself, and left before dessert. The next day, the dispute was resolved, and from that moment forward, she was never referred to by name, only as the one who sets tables. It was, by all accounts, the most Kazuo thing anyone had done in years. In this quiet transfer of tone, the organization proved something profound, that a legacy doesn't need heirs, just memory. And that memory, when shaped well, doesn't break. It bends over and over, folding into new forms that look nothing like the original, but carry its pressure, its edge, its discipline, like a fan closed tight, ready. There's a saying among old-timers in Kobe, murmured more like folklore than fact. The day the fan stops folding is the day the air forgets how to move. They say it about the wind, yes, but really, they mean him. Kazuo, Masaki, and the others who never needed names because they left shape instead. By 2010, that shape had become something else. Not a syndicate, not even a shadow, but a habit of silence that drifted across boardrooms, train stations, and dockyards, never touching down, always instructing by example. There were no more Kumichos, at least not in the old sense. Instead, the organization, if you could still call it that, had become a movement with posture, one that mimicked the discipline of old Yakuza without mimicking their errors. No press, no turf wars, no bravado, just presence. The city of Kobe adjusted around it. New zoning rules were passed without resistance. Permits were granted faster for businesses who hired from quiet lineages. Even temple renovations happened more smoothly if a particular tea shop down the street nodded twice during evening cleanup. No money changed hands, no threats, just timing. This, the locals whispered, was the third silence. The first had been Kazuo's, sharp, deliberate, constructed like an iron gate. The second had been Masaki's, subtle, veiled, methodical like condensation on glass. The third? No one could see it, but they all obeyed its rhythm. Even foreign governments took notice. A leaked embassy cable from 2012 described Kobe as a city exhibiting unusual social harmony despite historically high organized presence. No violence, no visible figureheads. Local customs appear instructed. Instructed? What a word! But they weren't wrong. In place of foot soldiers, there were consultants. In place of bookmakers, analysts. Instead of loyalty tests, there were apprenticeship dinners. Quiet meals where the only question that mattered was, did they pass the chopsticks before speaking? A university researcher studying post-organized crime syndicates coined the term structural echo to describe what Yamaguchi-gumi had become. He compared it to music left behind in a concert hall, shaping how future performances were played, even if the composer had long exited the stage. And through it all, something curious persisted. The fan, no one ever saw it opened anymore, but it remained. Drawn in graphite on stationery, etched on a teacup's underside, stitched into a lining of a blazer, a symbol not of rank, but of rhythm, and yet change pressed again. In 2015, a nationwide wave of digitization swept through government systems. Background checks became faster. Surveillance tools evolved. Even polite society, once silent on underworld influence, began to probe. And that raised a question. Can a ghost withstand a spotlight? Some inside the structure doubted. They argued it was time to disband entirely. to let the legacy fade on its own terms, to release the final folds of the fan and allow Japan to breathe anew. But others, those trained in the Masaki manner, said nothing. Instead, they made a move, not by issuing orders, but by removing obstacles. An old building in Nara, once used for record storage, burned down, not suspiciously, an accident caused by faulty wiring, or so it was claimed. But inside that building were the only remaining paper logs connecting the post-Kazuo era to early financial holdings. Gone. With it, any formal chain of succession. Some called it loss, but those who understood, they called it release, because when a thing is no longer traceable, it becomes what it always meant to be. Unburdened. That same year, a quiet dinner took place in a Kyoto guest house. 5 figures attended. No surnames used. No topics declared, only tea poured. Crickets chirped outside, and one fan placed on the center cushion. Never touched. When the dinner ended, it was still there. But one of the guests turned back at the doorway, picked it up, and tucked it beneath his jacket. He didn't speak, he just bowed, and with that, the third silence exhaled again. There's a weight to silence that only the truly trained can carry. Not the awkward hush of inexperience, nor the brooding pause of menace, but that rare, cultivated stillness that holds entire histories folded within it. And on a dim Kobe morning in late autumn, that weight passed, so lightly that the world barely noticed. A fisherman on the wharf near the American Park Lighthouse reported seeing a man sitting quietly just before sunrise, dressed in gray, holding something in his hands. He wasn't praying, the fisherman recalled. He was remembering. When the sun broke the harbor line, the man stood, dusted his coat, and placed a folded fan on the bench before walking away. The wind didn't move it, nor did the gulls. It simply remained, an object of no value and infinite meaning. No one picked it up. No one needed to, because those who knew, they had already inherited. By 2020, the structure that had once been Yamaguchi-gumi had no name, no leader, no listed assets, and yet it continued through influence, instinct, and invisible boundaries. In Osaka, a zoning dispute resolved itself when a mediator used phrasing that hadn't been public since the 1980s. In Fukuoka, a debt was forgiven by a logistics firm that had no legal link to any known syndicate, but its manager bowed before issuing the refund, just slightly longer than protocol required. And in Tokyo, a city councilman whispered to a reporter, "You won't find them, but you'll feel them." That's what legacy does when handled by those who prefer discipline over dominance. It becomes a frequency. In Kobe, streetlights are installed half a second out of sync with the national average, not by error, but by tradition. Something to do with the way Kazuo once timed his walks, or how Masaki liked shadows to fall just right when reading late letters. No one enforces this. It just happens, like breath. And what of the people? The ones still alive who remember the faces, the meetings, the sharp glances that made men sit straighter. They tend gardens now. They pour tea for guests without ever using honorifics. They watch the news and say nothing. And when asked about the past, they shrug and say, "It was a different world." But late at night sometimes, they unfold a fan, not for cooling, but for centering, and stare at it in the half-light, not remembering names, just rhythm. Because in this lineage, memory isn't stored in archives. It's embedded in the way chairs are arranged, and how long someone pauses before answering, and how quietly the door closes behind them. And that's where Kazuo Taoka still lives. Not in biography, not in tombstone etchings, but in behavior. He is the breath before a decision, the silence before a response, the stillness that makes a room recalibrate. And so it continues, not loudly, not always visibly, but faithfully, fold by fold, night by night, gesture by gesture, until one day someone forgets the origin of the fan, but still knows exactly how to hold it. So now, as the fan rests on the table's edge and the city outside hums with gentle hush, let the cadence of Kobe soften around you. Not every legacy echoes in marble or brass. Some are etched in how slowly a cup is set down, or how deliberately a person waits before they speak. Kazuo Taoka's story wasn't just one of power, but of pace. A quiet insistence that influence doesn't always need a spotlight. Sometimes it just needs space. The spaces between footsteps, between breaths, between questions and their answers. And now, you've walked those spaces. You've followed him from back alley agreements to silent tea rooms, from coded glances to the unspoken weight of a folded fan. You've seen how silence doesn't disappear. It trains the room. It shapes the air. It teaches even the loudest to lower their voices or leave altogether. So rest now, with that rhythm in your chest. The rhythm of men who led without spectacle, of streets that obeyed without orders, of fans that folded and closed without ever needing to open again. Let that quiet carry you into sleep. No sudden endings, no grand conclusions, just the subtle exhale of a story well folded. Kazuo is gone, but you're still here. And somewhere, someone is placing another fan on a table. Carefully, deliberately, faithfully, just like you've done tonight. Sweet dreams.